Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. We don't want to be here anymore. We're done. So is he asking you to kill him? I just don't understand. Yeah, that's what I've been doing for a while, and I can't get him to stop breathing. He is going to be 18 tomorrow, but he didn't want to turn 18. This boy never got the chance to turn 18 because his own mother made sure of that. Just hours before he was supposed to step into adulthood, she picked up the phone and called 911. But instead of crying for help, she delivered a chilling statement, and that is, she couldn't get him to stop breathing. Most mothers would fight tooth and nail to keep their child alive, but this one, she did the exact opposite. And it makes you wonder, what kind of mother does something so unthinkable? And how did it come to this? To even try to understand how this all happened, we have to go back to where it started, to a quiet little apartment complex that, by all accounts, should have been just another ordinary place to live. Bay Point Apartments, sitting at 791 East 16th Street in Holland, Michigan. A place meant to be a home, a safe haven, a spot where people came back after a long day, kicked off their shoes, and settled into the comfort of their lives. The Bay Point Apartments community wasn't just some rundown complex. It featured 1- and 2-bedroom units, along with 2-bedroom lofts. Residents had access to central heating and air conditioning, washer and dryer hookups in select apartments, and even a large swimming pool to cool off in the summer. It was a pet-friendly place, too. Cats and dogs were welcome, adding to the sense of home for those who lived there. On the surface, it was just another suburban apartment complex, the kind of place where people went about their business without too much drama. And among those residents were Katie Lee and her son, Austin Picart. Just a small family trying to make it through life like everyone else. From the outside, they seemed normal enough. Austin was a quiet, intelligent teenager with a deep love for books, science, and video games. He wasn't the kind of kid who got into trouble. If anything, he was the opposite. Smart, reserved, a bit of a dreamer. And Katie? She was a single mother who had spent years raising him on her own. Life wasn't easy, but they had each other. Neighbors didn't see anything too out of the ordinary. They weren't a loud, troublesome family. They kept to themselves, blended into the background of their small Michigan town. If you passed them on the street, you probably wouldn't have thought twice. But behind closed doors where no neighbors could see, where no friendly hellos could catch the truth, something was brewing. Something dark. Something no one saw coming. For years, Austin and his mom had an unusually close relationship. Some might even say it was too close. Friends recall that Katie was overprotective, treating Austin like a child even as he inched closer to adulthood. She had a hard time letting go, clinging to him like he was all she had in the world. And in a way, he was. Austin's father wasn't in the picture much, and Katie had no other children. It was just the two of them against the world, until apparently it wasn't. At first, Austin didn't seem to mind his mother's tight grip on his life. But as he got older, things changed. He wanted freedom, independence. He wanted to make his own choices. He was on the verge of turning 18, officially an adult, free to do whatever he pleased. Maybe he'd go off to college. Maybe he'd get a job and move out. Maybe he'd start a life of his own, one that didn't revolve around his mother. And that, it seems, is where things took a deadly turn. Sometime in the early hours of February 21st, 2025, just one day before Austin's 18th birthday, Katie Lee picked up the phone and dialed 911. But instead of the usual panic or desperation you'd expect in an emergency call, her words were cold, eerie, almost robotic. She told the dispatcher she couldn't get her son to stop breathing. "Hi, I need an officer here immediately." "Okay, to where?" "To the apartment she shared with her son, Austin Picard." "My son won't stop breathing." "He won't stop what?" "Breathing." "He won't stop breathing?" "Right." Let that sink in for a second. Not that he wasn't breathing. Not that he was in distress. But that she couldn't get him to stop. When police arrived at the Bay Point apartment complex, they found a scene straight out of a nightmare. Austin was dead. His throat had been slashed, and he had multiple stab wounds on his arms, wounds that, according to experts, looked suspiciously like defensive wounds, as if he had fought back, as if he hadn't wanted to die. Katie, standing at the doorway with a knife still in her hands, didn't resist arrest. But she didn't surrender easily either. She allegedly made a threatening move toward the officers, forcing them to deploy a taser before taking her into custody. Once she was down, She reportedly told investigators she had hoped the police would kill her so she could be with her son. Then the details got even darker. According to police reports, Katie and Austin had attempted to take their own lives together by overdosing on medication the previous day. But when Austin passed out and the overdose failed, Katie took matters into her own hands, literally. She grabbed a knife and slashed his throat while he lay unconscious. A brutal, irreversible act. The most baffling part of this case isn't just that a mother murdered her son. It's why she claims she did it. According to Katie, Austin didn't want to turn 18. He was afraid of adulthood, of growing up. He couldn't handle the idea of becoming an adult. But let's be real here. How many teenagers actually feel this way? Sure, some fear the responsibilities that come with adulthood. But let's not pretend turning 18 is some kind of death sentence. For most kids, that milestone is something to celebrate. It means freedom. It means being able to buy a lottery ticket, request, legally get a tattoo, vote, maybe even move out on their own. If Katie's claims were true, it would mean Austin had been suicidal. But was he? Had he actually begged his mother to help him stop breathing? Or was this just her twisted way of justifying the unthinkable? And even if he had been feeling suicidal, why wouldn't a mother seek help for her child instead of taking matters into her own hands? Why wouldn't she do everything in her power to prevent his death rather than cause it? The pieces just don't add up. For days later, Katie Lee appeared in court. Her face was stained with tears, and she could barely contain her sobs as she sat before the judge. Her shoulders shook uncontrollably, her body trembling as though the weight of everything had finally crashed down on her. For the entire 10-minute hearing, she wept, gasping between sobs, her emotions so raw that it almost seemed like she was just now realizing what she had done. Good afternoon. Are you Katie Austin Lee? Yes. Can you hear me all right, Ms. Lee? Yes. All right. I'm Judge Ganal, and I'm writing to you from the District Court in Holland. This is file 2516105FY. But if she thought her tears would earn her sympathy, she was gravely mistaken. Judge Bradley Knoll was unmoved. His expression remained hard, unreadable, and his decision was swift and absolute, no bond. Katie wouldn't be walking free anytime soon. Perhaps it was the right call, considering her behavior when officers first arrived at the scene. She hadn't just cooperated meekly when they found her. No, she had allegedly threatened them, her grief and anger manifesting as violence, a knife still in her hands. She hadn't wanted to let go of it. She hadn't wanted to surrender. And now, here she was, her fate slipping further and further out of her control. Even in court, her defiance hadn't disappeared entirely. She resisted the public defender's office, refusing legal representation at first, as though she could take on this case alone. But reality wasn't something she could ignore. After several minutes of back and forth, of whispered conversations and quiet pleas from those trying to help her, she finally gave in. With a hollow nod, she agreed to let them assign her a public defender. It was the only choice she had left. But the real shock of the day wasn't Katie's sobs, nor was it the judge's unwavering stance. The most jaw-dropping moment didn't come from Katie at all. It came from her family. They were still there, standing by her, supporting her. Even after everything, they hadn't abandoned her. As the hearing came to a close, as the judge gave his final words and the proceedings were wrapped up, voices from the courtroom rose, breaking through the heavy silence, saying, "We love you, Katie." However, the legal battle ahead is grim. Katie Lee is facing an open murder charge, which means the jury will be the ones to decide what degree of murder she is guilty of. If they determine she acted with premeditation, if they believe she planned her son's death beforehand, then she will be convicted of first-degree murder, a charge that could lead to life in prison. But if the jury finds that she acted in the heat of the moment, without prior planning, then she will be convicted of second-degree murder. Either way, the result is the same. Austin is gone, and Katie Lee will pay the price. But her troubles don't end there. On top of the murder charge, she's also facing a charge of resisting and obstructing an officer. When police arrived at the scene, she allegedly waved a knife at them, her behavior erratic and aggressive. It was as if she had no intention of making things easy, not for herself, not for law enforcement, not for anyone. No official trial date has been set yet, but when it does happen, it won't just be another case for the books. This trial will be something people won't forget. It will be a long, painful process for everyone involved. Austin's friends, who are still trying to make sense of his sudden and brutal death, his extended family, who now have to live with a nightmare they never imagined, and even the outsiders, the true crime followers who consume these cases daily, but still find themselves shaken by this one. Because no matter how many stories we hear about parents killing their children, this one feels different. This one feels personal. And the biggest question remains, why? Why did Katie Lee do this? What could possibly make a mother take her own child's life? The explanation she allegedly gave, that Austin didn't want to live past 17, is chilling. It's the kind of statement that makes you pause, that makes you wonder if you heard it correctly. There is no known history of suicidal thoughts. No evidence has surfaced that suggests he struggled with depression. No close friends or relatives have come forward to say that he had been unhappy. If anything, Austin's future seemed bright. He loved science. He loved space. He had dreams and aspirations, ideas of who he wanted to become. So why would he suddenly wish to throw all of that away? And then, there's the possibility of money. Follow the money. That's what investigators always say. Did she have a life insurance policy on Austin? Could there have been something to gain financially from his death? Nothing has been confirmed yet, but it's a question worth asking. People have killed for far less. If Katie stood to benefit financially, then suddenly, this case takes on an even darker edge. Or was the answer something even more terrifying? Was mental illness at play? Did she suffer from delusions? Did she believe she was saving Austin? There have been cases before where people, often suffering from severe psychological disorders, convince themselves that killing their loved ones is an act of mercy. Did Katie truly believe Austin was better off dead? Did she think she was doing him a favor? And what about drugs? Could she have been under the influence? Drug use can explain erratic behavior, paranoia, aggression. But here's the most horrifying part. No toxicology reports have been mentioned, which means that, as of now, there is no evidence that Katie was high when she did this. And that makes it so much worse. Because if she wasn't in some drug-induced haze, if she wasn't under the influence of anything, then that means she did it completely sober. It means she made this choice with a clear mind. Perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of this entire case is the reaction from Katie's family. How does one rationalize standing by a family member after something like this? How do you look at a woman who has done something so unspeakable and still say, "We love you"? Is it denial? A refusal to accept reality? Or is it something deeper, a kind of unconditional love that defies logic? Some families cut ties immediately, unable to stomach the betrayal. Others cling to the past, unable to let go of the person they once knew. But at some point, reality has to set in. At some point, they will have to ask themselves, if Katie Lee could do this to Austin, who's to say she wouldn't have done it to someone else? Who's to say she wouldn't do it again? At the heart of this case is a single devastating truth. Katie Lee failed her son in the worst way imaginable. A mother is supposed to protect her child, to keep them safe, to be their shield against the horrors of the world. Instead, Katie became the monster her son should have been protected from. And the worst part, we may never fully understand why. No matter how many hearings take place, no matter how many psychological evaluations are conducted, one voice will never be heard. Austin's. And that is the real tragedy. The remaining family is doing everything they can to keep Austin's memory alive. They even created a GoFundMe in his honor, hoping to give him the kind of send-off he deserves. The organizer, Elisa Paycart, didn't go into details about what really happened, but one thing is clear. They want the world to remember Austin for the bright, loving person he was, not the way his life ended. She described him as caring, funny, and full of life. He loved his family and friends more than anything. But if there was one thing that truly fascinated him, it was space, galaxies, planets, the unknown. He loved it all. And now his family has come up with a plan that feels almost poetic. Instead of a traditional burial, they want to send his ashes into space on an actual rocket ship. It's the kind of farewell that matches his dreams, making sure that even in death, he reaches for the stars. Of course, losing someone like this isn't just emotionally devastating. It comes with financial struggles, too. Funerals, memorials, and everything in between add up fast. Elisa said that some people have already reached out, asking how they can help. And honestly, the best way right now is through donations. Every little bit helps as they work toward their goal of celebrating Austin's life the way he would have wanted. So far, the GoFundMe has raised over $6,000, but they're hoping to reach $12,000. It's not just about money. It's about giving Austin a proper goodbye, one that honors the person he was. Meanwhile, Katie Lee is sitting in jail, facing some of the most serious charges imaginable. Open murder, resisting an officer, no bond. She's not going anywhere anytime soon. And if she's convicted, Michigan law could put her away for life. Case 2. It was a quiet Wednesday evening in Dallas. Around 7:40 p.m., Kendra Hatcher pulled into the parking garage of her apartment building, just like she always did after work. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, until suddenly, everything changed. People nearby heard a scream, then a loud gunshot. Seconds later, a black Jeep sped out of the garage, leaving behind a scene that would soon shock the entire city. At first, no one knew what had really happened or why. But as the investigation began, it led to a story filled with jealousy, secrets, and a plan that had been in the works for weeks. And it all started the moment Kendra pulled into that garage. In September 2015, Kendra's life seemed to be falling perfectly into place. After growing up and building her career as a dentist in Pleasant Plains, Illinois, she made a big move to Dallas, Texas, seeking a new beginning. Instead of chasing prestige by opening her own clinic, which would have been the expected route for someone with her qualifications, Kendra made a choice that reflected her character. She joined Smile Zone, an organization committed to delivering quality dental care to underprivileged children. To her, this was more than just a job. It was a way to give back, to serve, and to truly make a difference. Outside of work, Kendra was equally dedicated to her faith. She volunteered her time teaching others about the Bible, and was actively involved in international mission efforts, helping build churches in other countries. Smile Zone even provided free dental services to children in Ecuador, something that made Kendra feel even more connected to her purpose. By all accounts, she was a generous, compassionate person, always thinking of others first. Earlier that year, in May, Kendra had connected with Ricardo Ricci Paniagua on Tinder. By September, their connection had blossomed into something deep and serious. They were head over heels in love. Kendra lived in a high-end apartment building in Dallas called Gables Park 17. It was a secure complex, complete with 24-hour concierge service, numerous surveillance cameras, and controlled access parking. Ricci was on a promising path himself. He was completing a dermatology residency at the University of Texas, and things between him and Kendra had become so strong that they were already talking about marriage. Even though they'd only been together for 4 months, it felt right. Their values aligned, and they saw each other as soulmates. Kendra's kindness, beauty, and generosity touched everyone who knew her. She had worked hard to create the life she was living, putting love and energy into both her career and her relationship. But sometimes, a person's light can cast a shadow in someone else's heart, and where jealousy festers, tragedy can follow. On Wednesday, September 2nd, after finishing her shift at Smile Zone, Kendra returned to her apartment. She was looking forward to the upcoming Labor Day weekend. She and Ricci had plans to travel to Mexico. They were also excited to talk more seriously about relocating to San Francisco after their trip. Life seemed full of promise. She arrived at Gables Park 17 at exactly 7:42 p.m., entered the parking garage, and pulled into her regular spot. Just moments later, 2 people inside the garage heard a woman screaming, followed by the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. Another resident also heard the terrifying noise. Though he didn't know what had just occurred, he didn't hesitate to call 911. Meanwhile, witnesses noticed a Jeep Cherokee speeding out of the garage. They couldn't say for certain if it was related, but the timing raised concern. Police rushed to the scene, but it was already too late. Kendra was gone. There had been no known threats or enemies in her life, nothing to suggest that someone would want to harm her. It didn't make sense. As officers began collecting evidence, they quickly realized her purse was missing. It wasn't in her car or anywhere nearby. This led detectives to consider robbery as a possible motive. Near where her body was found, investigators recovered a handgun magazine and fragments from bullets, which were taken in as evidence. As detectives dug deeper into the scene, what they uncovered was far more disturbing than anyone could have anticipated. Early on, they had considered the possibility of a robbery gone wrong, but as more forensic evidence came in, that theory started to crumble. Gunshot residue was found on Kendra's hands, suggesting she had her hands behind her head when the trigger was pulled. And the bullet's trajectory? It indicated she had been on her knees, shot from behind. An execution-style killing, not a chaotic scuffle during a theft. This was no random act. It was cold, calculated, planned. Officers were left grappling with the question, who could do this to someone like Kendra? She had no enemies, no one with a known grudge, yet someone had gone out of their way to stage the scene like a robbery, hoping to throw off investigators. Once the scene had been cleared and Kendra's body taken into care, police had the painful task of informing Ricky. Hearing the news left him shattered. That night, in a haze of grief, he reached out to someone from his past, Brenda Delgado, his ex-girlfriend and longtime friend. Brenda was stunned to hear what had happened, and promised to support Ricky however she could. Meanwhile, the investigation pressed forward. Investigators turned to surveillance footage from Gables Park 17. That's when things took a major turn. Cameras had captured a Jeep Cherokee pulling into the parking garage at 7:15 p.m., nearly half an hour before Kendra arrived. Then, a man was seen walking toward the section of the garage where Kendra later parked. Not long after, he returned to the Jeep. Who was he? Detectives believed this man was the shooter, but there was a problem. No one recognized him, and the footage didn't reveal the vehicle's license plate. Then came another twist. Shortly after the man climbed back into the Jeep, a woman was spotted behind the wheel, driving the vehicle out of the garage. Now, it was obvious. This wasn't spontaneous. It was a team effort, a premeditated hit. Since the footage alone didn't provide enough to make an arrest, police released still images to the public, hoping someone would come forward. In many cases, these types of appeals lead nowhere, but this time they struck gold. Shortly after the images went public, a man named Jose Luis Ortiz contacted authorities. He recognized the Jeep in the photos. It was his. However, he insisted that he wasn't the one driving it that night, and had no idea the vehicle had been used in a crime. Normally, police would approach such a claim with skepticism, but Jose had more to say. Much more. He told investigators that on the morning of September 2nd, Brenda Delgado and a woman named Crystal Cortez had asked him for help with Crystal's car. It was having engine trouble, and they wondered if they could borrow his Jeep just for the day. Trying to be helpful, Jose agreed. He assumed they needed the car to get to work, and had no reason to suspect anything sinister. They arranged to meet back at his place later that evening, but the plans changed suddenly. Brenda called to suggest they meet at a Chili's restaurant instead. Jose thought nothing of it, until he arrived and found neither Crystal nor his Jeep there. Eventually they did return the vehicle, but by then, Jose had already seen the news about Kendra's death, and realized that his Jeep had been caught on camera leaving the scene. He immediately confronted Brenda. At first, she brushed it off, claiming the vehicle in the footage must have been a similar-looking one. Just a coincidence. But soon, her story shifted. She admitted Crystal had taken the Jeep to Kendra's apartment building, but claimed it was just to pick up illegal goods for someone else. According to her, something must have gone wrong, and Kendra had gotten caught in the crossfire. Jose was stunned and furious. Then came the most chilling part of the story. After confessing to what had really happened, Brenda allegedly begged Jose not to talk to the police. She warned him that cooperating could cost him his U.S. citizenship, even if he had nothing to do with the crime itself. To cover their tracks, she even suggested painting the Jeep a different color and offered to pay for it. That's when everything clicked for Jose. The deception, the manipulation, the lies. Realizing he'd unknowingly lent his car to people involved in something horrific, he knew he couldn't stay silent. His decision to come forward would blow the case wide open and shine a light on a tangled web of jealousy, betrayal, and cold-blooded murder. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Jose Luis Ortiz didn't waste any time. He knew that if he wanted to clear his name, he had to go straight to the police, and that's exactly what he did. Once detectives had his statement, their focus quickly shifted to Brenda Delgado. When officers finally brought her in for questioning, Brenda appeared calm and composed. She told them she had never heard of Kendra Hatcher before, and claimed she had no connection to the victim whatsoever. To back up her story, she produced receipts from Chili's, saying she was there at the time of the murder, having dinner with Jose. She also claimed that if the police really wanted answers, they should be asking more questions about Crystal Cortez. Brenda admitted they had borrowed Jose's Jeep together, but insisted she let Crystal use it alone for the rest of the day. That led detectives straight to Crystal, who had quite a story of her own. According to Crystal, she was the woman seen behind the wheel of the Jeep in the garage security footage, but she claimed she had no choice in the matter. She told police she and her young son had been carjacked by an armed man, who forced her to drive him to the building where Kendra was later killed. It was a desperate explanation and an obvious lie. Investigators had already combed through the surveillance video and saw no sign of a child in the car. They challenged her version of events immediately, and Crystal, caught in her own web, quickly shifted gears. This time, she admitted to driving the man to the building, but now said she did so willingly, thinking he was going to commit a robbery, and the person who had orchestrated it all, according to her, was none other than Brenda Delgado. Crystal claimed she had no idea the plan would end in murder. She insisted she was simply doing a favor for a friend. But now, with her lies unraveling, she admitted to playing a part in the crime, and she wasn't about to take the fall alone. She revealed that Brenda had set everything in motion out of jealousy. Brenda couldn't stand that Ricky, her ex-boyfriend, had moved on and found happiness with Kendra. That envy, Crystal said, was the real motive behind the whole thing. With that, the puzzle began to come together. Detectives now had a clearer picture. Brenda wasn't just bitter, she was obsessed. The moment Brenda found out Ricky was dating Kendra, something inside her shifted. Even though Ricky had been with other women after their breakup, this time felt different. He and Kendra were serious, and Brenda couldn't handle it. Wanting to be respectful, Ricky had sent Brenda an email letting her know he was in a committed relationship. She replied kindly, saying she was happy for him and hoped they could remain friends. On the surface, it looked like a mature response, but privately, Brenda was devastated. That heartbreak quickly turned dark. In the weeks that followed, she began obsessing over their relationship. She couldn't let go. According to Crystal, it was just 2 weeks after they met that Brenda confided in her, saying she wanted Kendra gone permanently. Instead of walking away, Crystal shockingly agreed to help. As the two women began plotting, Brenda's obsession took over her life. She stopped showing up to work, spent hours tracking Ricky's movements, and eventually gained access to his email. That's when she saw everything. The vacation plans, the idea of moving in together, the life he and Kendra were building. Brenda told Crystal she felt like Kendra had stolen the future that was meant to be hers. That she was an outsider pretending to live Brenda's life. As the jealousy deepened, so did the violence in Brenda's thoughts. Before talking to Crystal, she had approached her cousin and asked if he'd be willing to attack Kendra with a baseball bat. Thankfully, he refused. But that didn't stop Brenda. Her desire to reclaim Ricky became a dangerous obsession, and Kendra, in her mind, was the only thing standing in the way. And the worst was still to come. Then she approached another friend, Jennifer Escobar, and proposed the same violent idea. This time, she claimed that if Kendra were attacked and fell into a coma, she'd have time to win Ricky back. Jennifer was horrified and turned her down immediately. By this point, Brenda had fully crossed the line. She had hacked into Ricky's email, monitoring his private life obsessively. Jennifer was deeply concerned. Not only did Brenda still have a copy of Ricky's house keys, but she also had access to his bank accounts. Ricky had no idea. When Jennifer rejected her again, Brenda escalated. She pitched a new plan. Instead of using brute force, why not use a lethal injection? She even offered Jennifer a car, $2,000, and the chemical agent to do the job. But Jennifer, thankfully, walked away again. Eventually, Brenda found someone who would listen, Crystal Cortez. Crystal was struggling to provide for her child as a single mom and was drawn to Brenda's apparent stability. She admired that Brenda had a good job, her own apartment, and a steady income. That admiration quickly turned into dangerous loyalty. As they began plotting, Brenda gave Crystal $500, proof of which was later found as a bank withdrawal receipt among Brenda's belongings. Now they just needed someone willing to commit the actual crime. So the two women began cruising through Crystal's neighborhood, an area they believed would be more likely to harbor someone desperate enough to carry out a murder for hire. They made several offers to people on the street, but everyone turned them down. It's chilling to think that they were essentially shopping around for a hitman in broad daylight. Eventually, they found someone willing, a 31-year-old man named Christopher Love. Not only did he agree, but he also helped them figure out the logistics. In the end, they all settled on using a firearm. It would be fast and final. Brenda promised him money and drugs in return, and even teased the idea of introducing him to members of a drug cartel. By then, Brenda had read enough of Ricky's emails to know that he and Kendra were planning a weekend getaway to Mexico. They were also talking about moving cities after the trip. To Brenda, that was the final straw. She wanted the crime done, and done immediately. She and Crystal began tailing Kendra, learning her routine. They even watched her at work, using binoculars from across the street while parked at a Salvation Army store. After following her home one day, they discovered that they could access the parking garage by simply trailing another resident through the gate. Everything was falling into place. On September 1st, the trio ran a dry rehearsal to make sure everyone knew their roles. The next day, Brenda and Crystal borrowed Jose's Jeep and picked up Christopher. Brenda was dropped off at a public library to establish an alibi, while the other two headed toward Smile Zone, where Kendra worked. Crystal had to briefly leave to pick up her son and nephew from school, then dropped them off at her grandmother's before returning to the plan. They spotted Kendra leaving work, but lost her in traffic. Still, they reached her apartment before she did. Inside the parking garage, they waited. When Kendra finally pulled in, Christopher stepped out of the vehicle and followed her. Moments later, the plan was executed. Crystal remained out of sight. Afterward, they fled, dropped Christopher at his home, and Crystal returned the Jeep to Jose. Everything unraveled when Crystal decided to cooperate with authorities. As part of her plea deal, she laid out the entire plan to prosecutors. In exchange, she received a 35-year prison sentence instead of life, though many believe she won't serve the full term before being considered for parole. The murder weapon was later found in Christopher's car, sealing his fate. He confessed, confirming Brenda had been the one calling the shots, but by then, Crystal had already provided the prosecution with every detail they needed. Christopher was sentenced to death for pulling the trigger. Brenda, the mastermind, was the last piece of the puzzle. Once she realized the walls were closing in, she fled. For 7 months, she managed to evade capture, landing herself on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. A $100,000 reward was offered for information leading to her arrest. Eventually, authorities tracked her down in Mexico. In April the following year, she was taken into custody. To secure her extradition back to the U.S., officials agreed not to pursue the death penalty. In court, Brenda pleaded not guilty and insisted she had an alibi for the time of the murder. But the jury wasn't fooled. They saw through the lies. They found her guilty of orchestrating the crime and sentenced her to life in prison with no chance of parole. The most painful part? Kendra had never even met the people who ended her life. She had never spoken to them, never wronged them. She was simply the target of someone else's envy and obsession. When someone becomes consumed by jealousy, it can twist their sense of reality and morality. In most cases, people eventually come to terms with heartbreak and find a way to move on. But Brenda couldn't. She chose destruction over acceptance. And now, she'll pay with the rest of her life. Still, even with justice served, nothing can undo the loss of Kendra Hatcher, a bright, compassionate woman whose life was stolen far too soon. Case 3. It was a normal Tuesday evening at Harvey Nichols, a fancy department store in London. The day was winding down, and most of the workers were getting ready to go home. Claire Bernal, just 22 years old, was at her usual spot at the beauty counter. She smiled at a coworker nearby, thinking the day was almost over, but then, in just a few seconds, everything changed. Loud bangs rang through the store, people screamed, workers ran, it was chaos. What happened that night shocked everyone who knew Claire. But the truth is, the trouble didn't start that day. It had been building for a long time. There were signs, there were warnings, and there was someone Claire had been afraid of for months. So who was he? What led to that awful moment? And why didn't anyone stop it? This is the heartbreaking story of Claire Bernal. Claire Bernal was born in July 1983 in the charming town of Groombridge in the UK. Her parents, Tricia and Martin Bernal, raised her in a loving and peaceful home. From an early age, Claire's love for beauty and creativity began to shine. She went to St. Gregory's Roman Catholic Comprehensive School in Tunbridge Wells, where she was known for her gentle nature and bright spirit. After finishing school, she continued her education at West Kent College. It was there she decided to pursue her passion further and enrolled in a beauty therapy program. Claire had always been fascinated by makeup. As a child, she'd spend hours in front of the mirror, carefully applying makeup with a sparkle in her eye. Her mom, Tricia, often said Claire had a natural gift. She could bring out beauty in anyone. That passion eventually turned into a career goal. And with her diploma in hand, Claire was ready to step into the world of beauty consulting. Those who knew her best described Claire as sweet, gentle, and impossibly kind. She avoided conflict, smiled with genuine warmth, and radiated calm. She had a humble heart and a desire to make the world just a little softer. Her kindness made her a beloved presence wherever she went, but it also meant she sometimes saw the world through rose-colored glasses. Still, she stayed true to herself, quiet, shy, and never one to speak ill of others. Claire had also dabbled in theater makeup, and when she saw a job listing for a beauty consultant at the prestigious Harvey Nichols store in London, she immediately applied. The upscale department store, known for its luxury brands and elite clientele, felt like the perfect fit for her. She walked into her interview fully prepared, and her enthusiasm for the role left a lasting impression. Shortly after, she received the call she had hoped for. She got the job. Overjoyed, Claire called her friend Adam Ward before the interview, full of nerves, unsure how she had done. Adam reassured her that her doubt was just part of who she was. She always gave her best, but never believed it was enough. When she got the job, Adam couldn't have been happier. Soon after landing the role, Claire moved into a flat in South London, sharing the space with 2 roommates. Living in London was a dream come true. She embraced the energy of the city and flourished in her new life. Claire loved her work, and it showed. Customers adored her, colleagues respected her, and it was clear she was made for this world. Soft-spoken and modest, yet driven and talented, Claire made it her goal to help every woman feel confident and beautiful. In July 2005, for her birthday, Claire and her mom went on a getaway to Florence, Italy. It was a magical 5-day trip filled with sightseeing, laughter, and endless memories. For Trisha, those days were priceless. She and Claire were incredibly close. Not just mother and daughter, but true best friends. Looking back, Trisha remembers that trip as one of the happiest times in her daughter's life. But that joy would be shattered just 2 months later. On September 13, 2005, Claire was nearing the end of her shift at Harvey Nichols. She was tired and looking forward to a quiet evening at home. Standing all day at the makeup counter was no easy feat, and she was ready to unwind. Victoria Daniels, a colleague working just a few counters away, recalled seeing Claire cleaning up and smiling at her as if to say, "Almost done." That was the last moment of calm before chaos erupted. Victoria noticed a man approaching Claire. Everything happened in a blink. She saw something dark in his hand, a flash, and then came the sound. Loud, sharp bangs echoed through the store. Panic broke out instantly. Shoppers and staff ran for cover. Witnesses later said 5 shots rang out, and then a terrible silence. Police arrived within minutes. Inside, they found a scene no one could ever forget. 2 people lay on the floor. One was Claire Bernal, just 22 years old. The other was a man whose injuries were self-inflicted. The man was quickly identified by store staff. It was 30-year-old Michael Petch, a security guard who worked at Harvey Nichols. Authorities now understood. Michael had targeted Claire and then taken his own life. When officers delivered the heartbreaking news to Trisha Bernal, she was devastated. Through her tears, she asked one haunting question. It was Michael Petch, wasn't it? Everyone, Trisha, the staff, even the police, knew Michael's name. But no one could fully grasp why this had happened. Why someone so gentle and full of life was taken in such a violent way. The horrifying truth was that Claire had been living through months of fear, emotional torment, and harassment, all centered around Michael. Their paths crossed by chance at Harvey Nichols in London, where Claire worked as a beauty consultant and Michael was employed as a security guard. Originally from the Czech Republic and Slovakia, Michael held citizenship in both countries. He had once served in the Slovakian army, but was discharged. He'd also worked as a security guard at the U.S. Embassy before moving to the UK and settling in North London. Around this time, he joined the security team at Harvey Nichols. When Michael saw Claire, he became instantly drawn to her kind and soft-spoken nature. The two began chatting occasionally, and in January 2005, Michael asked Claire out. She agreed, and over the course of 3 weeks, they went on 3 dates. But even early on, Claire's mother, Trisha, didn't feel right about the man. He was older, recently separated, and something about him didn't sit well with her. Still, Claire wasn't deeply invested in the relationship. According to her family, she enjoyed the attention, but didn't feel the same intensity Michael did. Michael, however, quickly became infatuated. He showered Claire with praise, and even declared his love for her after just a few outings. Claire liked him well enough at first, but things began to shift. Very quickly, she saw a possessive, jealous side emerge. He demanded her time, grew upset when she spent time with loved ones, and pushed boundaries. Trisha later recalled that Claire had noticed red flags even after the first date. She simply hadn't expected the situation to spiral out of control so fast. The relationship became overwhelming. After returning from a trip to Slovakia, Michael insisted Claire collect him from the airport and pressured her to let him stay at her place, despite their short-lived connection. Claire refused, walking him to the train station and calmly telling him she wasn't interested in seeing him anymore. But Michael didn't take no for an answer. He began bombarding Claire with calls. When she didn't respond, he showed up outside her home and waited there for 2 hours, yelling and demanding to see her. Neighbors and Claire's roommates overheard his shouting. It wasn't until one of the roommates confronted him and said Claire didn't want to see him that he finally left. The next day, Claire hoped that would be the end of it, but instead Michael showed up again, this time holding a large bouquet and following her to and from work. He pleaded with her to give him another chance, but she continued to say no. His behavior intensified. Claire's phone was overwhelmed with calls, sometimes up to 50 in a single day. His voicemails became increasingly disturbing. He began making up fantasies, saying things like, "Tomorrow's our anniversary, how should we celebrate?" And then came a chilling message, "If I can't have you, no one will." Claire was terrified. At one point, she even changed her phone number, but Michael somehow got the new one and resumed his obsessive communication. Work became unbearable. Michael would stare at her through mirrors or glass, and even tried to get other staff members to convince her to speak to him. On one occasion, she gave in and spoke to him briefly. That's when he cornered her, pinned her against the wall, and declared she loved him too. When she denied it, he exploded with rage, screaming, "Yes you do, you stupid little girl." Michael, the very person who was supposed to protect people in the store, was now the source of Claire's fear, and she had nowhere to turn except the police. For 2 months, Claire lived in constant fear. Her performance at work suffered. She was late, distracted, and emotionally drained. She always felt like someone was watching her, because someone was. In March 2005, something truly terrifying happened. Claire was walking home when she spotted Michael tailing her. She got on a train to lose him, but he followed. When they both got off at the next station, he grabbed her by the arm. She threatened to call the police, and his response sent shivers down her spine. "If you report me, I'll kill you." Frozen, Claire didn't know what to do. Michael smiled in a twisted, unsettling way before exiting the train, never taking his eyes off her. Claire ran home and collapsed in tears. She told her mother everything. The stalking, the threats, the emotional torment. It had all reached a dangerous breaking point, and tragically, that fear turned out to be justified. Claire's family felt utterly powerless. Watching someone they loved unravel under the weight of fear and stress was devastating. Claire wasn't sleeping well, and her anxiety had grown unbearable. More than anything, she just wanted Michael to leave her alone. But by then, she was too scared to even involve the police. The fear of what he might do held her back. Eventually, Claire came to a hard truth. Trying to reason with Michael was useless. So she decided to seek help from her employers at Harvey Nichols. After 2 long months of relentless stalking, she brought the situation to their attention. Fortunately, the store's head of security, himself a former police officer, took Claire's concerns seriously. He began monitoring Michael through CCTV footage. After seeing the disturbing behavior firsthand, he and the rest of the team agreed that Michael needed to be relocated to another floor in the store, believing this would keep Claire safe. But Michael wasn't deterred. He still knew where she lived, and even after being moved at work, he continued to stalk her. Once Harvey Nichols officials realized the extent of his actions, they suspended him. From there, the head of security urged Claire to go to the authorities. Though she hesitated, embarrassed, unsure, and just wanting the nightmare to end, she did eventually file a report with the police. That decision would later prove to be both courageous and heartbreaking. Michael was arrested soon after, at the very store where he had once worked. Officers placed him in handcuffs and escorted him out. He was immediately fired. But what stayed with Claire the most wasn't his arrest. It was the look he gave her as they put him in the back of the police car. Cold and bitter, his eyes burned with anger, silently blaming her for it all. Shaken, Claire called her mother right away. Tricia recalled Claire saying she didn't want Michael to get into trouble, but she felt like she had no choice. He simply wouldn't stop. Even after everything he'd done, Claire still worried about him. At the police station, Michael was questioned, and disturbingly, he tried to flip the story. He claimed that he had ended things with Claire, and that she was the one who couldn't let go. It was a twisted version of events, and with no hard evidence besides Claire's statement, the police released him. He was given a restraining order, banned from going near Claire's home, workplace, or even being in her general area. But Michael had no intention of following the rules. Just 2 days later, he was spotted outside Claire's apartment, casually waving at her. When the police were called, he disappeared before they arrived. Another incident followed soon after. This time, he was arrested for violating his bail conditions. As officers led him away, he smiled at Claire once more, a chilling reminder that he wasn't done. Michael spent 8 days in custody. But before the trial, he was released again while the court prepared a pre-sentence report. His next court date was scheduled for September 21st. This time, too, the conditions of his bail barred him from contacting Claire or going near her. But the decision to release him again baffled everyone. Michael had already proven that he would ignore the law. Why grant him another chance? It's hard to say exactly why. Maybe Claire, being as gentle and kind as she was, downplayed the severity of his behavior. Or maybe the officials in charge of his case failed to grasp the danger she was truly in. But after his second release, Michael didn't go straight back to stalking. Instead, he vanished for a while, flying to Slovakia. On the surface, it seemed like a trip to visit family. But that wasn't his reason. Michael went there to attend a firearms training course. It was around the same time that Claire and Tricia were enjoying their vacation in Florence, Italy. They laughed, took photos, and cherished the time together, completely unaware that it would be their last trip. While they made beautiful memories, Michael was preparing something horrifying, something that no one saw coming. Somehow, Michael Peck managed to travel from Slovakia back to the UK with a firearm hidden in his luggage. He had acquired the weapon during his time abroad, and disturbingly, was able to smuggle it out of the country without raising any red flags. By August 31st, the date of his scheduled court hearing, Claire had emotionally braced herself to testify, though the thought of seeing Michael again filled her with dread. But a call from the magistrate's court brought unexpected news. Michael had entered a guilty plea. There would be no trial. While this brought some relief to Claire, it also left her unsettled. Despite pleading guilty, Michael was allowed to remain free until his sentencing, set for September 21st. For Claire, this meant 3 more weeks of uncertainty. At first, those weeks felt oddly peaceful. Nearly 2 weeks went by with no signs of Michael. For the first time in months, Claire began to feel like herself again. Light, hopeful, even happy. But that calm was tragically short-lived. September 13th would become the day that shattered everything. Michael had stopped stalking Claire, not because he had let go, but because he was waiting. Waiting for the right moment to act out the violent obsession that had consumed him. Just before closing time at Harvey Nichols, it's believed that Michael, possibly under the influence of drugs, snuck in through a rear entrance. Armed and determined, he approached the beauty counter where Claire was working. Then, without hesitation, he opened fire. 4 bullets struck Claire. She died at the scene. Seconds later, Michael turned the gun on himself and ended his life too. The horror unfolded in front of colleagues and customers. Many witnessed the attack firsthand and were left permanently traumatized. The scene was brutal, the pain immeasurable. Michael Peck, a disturbed and obsessive man, couldn't handle rejection. Rather than accepting it and moving on, he made Claire pay with her life. And in his final act, he stole any chance of justice or accountability. Everyone was left stunned, heartbroken, furious. And yet, for many, this outcome wasn't entirely surprising. Too often, stalking is dismissed as harmless or not taken seriously enough by authorities. In Claire's case, she did everything right. She tried to distance herself. She went to her employers. She filed police reports. But time and time again, the system failed to protect her. Michael was granted bail repeatedly, despite clear warning signs. The restraining orders and court conditions meant nothing to him. They were just empty promises printed on paper. Claire's funeral, held just weeks later, was unbearably heartbreaking. Her parents, shattered by the loss, watched their beloved daughter, once vibrant, full of life, lowered into the earth. Friends and family gathered to say goodbye to a young woman with so much left to experience. A future that was stolen in a single act of violence. But the pain didn't stop there. Claire's death caused a painful divide between her grieving parents. At the inquest, her father, Martin, Tricia's former husband, criticized her, claiming she had underestimated the danger Claire was in. He also condemned the police for their failure to perform a proper risk assessment during the investigation. Martin revealed that Claire had been staying with him in her final days, yet she hadn't told him what she was going through. He believed that, if he had known, things might have turned out differently. When Tricia took the stand, she broke down in tears. She admitted she had put too much faith in the system. "I had an extremely close relationship with my daughter," she said. "I thought the police had it under control. That was my mistake, and I have to live with that." It was a heartbreaking moment. 2 parents united in loss, but divided by pain. The truth is, no one was to blame but Michael. And yet, grief has a way of distorting everything. After Claire's death, Tricia turned her pain into purpose. She began campaigning for change, determined to make sure other families wouldn't suffer the same way. She joined forces with relatives of other stalking victims and helped establish the Family Justice Center, a support network advocating for victims of stalking and domestic violence. The group pushed for a new law that would officially classify stalking as a criminal offense. In 2012, after years of advocacy, that goal was finally achieved. Stalking was made a crime in the UK. It was a long overdue step, but even now progress remains slow. Despite the law, countless victims still feel ignored. Many say that unless violence actually occurs, the authorities remain reluctant to step in. Monsters like Michael thrive in that gap, where behavior is terrifying, but not yet classified as criminal. No one should live in fear, because someone refuses to let go. No one has the right to terrorize another human being, because of wounded pride. It's unbearable to know that Claire did everything she could to stay safe, and still, the system failed her. Michael didn't just take Claire's life, he took her future, her family's joy, and any chance at closure. Case 4. In this quiet, old-fashioned town of Rockdale Township, Pennsylvania, where the Amish embrace a life of simplicity, a nightmare unfolded that no one could have ever imagined. The Amish are known for their peaceful way of life, where violence is rare and murder is practically unheard of. But then came Edward Gingrich, a man who would shatter that history in the most brutal and disturbing way possible. He didn't just kill someone, he carved out his victims' organs and stacked them in a grotesque display, leaving behind a crime scene so horrifying that even seasoned investigators were shaken. And it made Edward the first recorded Amish murderer in over 200 years. Of all the cases we've uncovered, this is one that will stick with you for days, making you wonder, if Edward had been taken to a modern doctor sooner, could this tragedy have been prevented? You can let me know your thoughts once you hear the full story, because trust me, this is as tragic as the mind of the man who committed it. For starters, Edward was one of 11 children, born into a deeply traditional Amish family. When he was 18 years old, his family packed up and moved to Crawford County, Pennsylvania, in 1983. Life in an Amish community is all about simplicity, faith, and following strict rules. But from a young age, Edward never quite fit the mold. While most Amish boys grew up learning farming and carpentry, Edward had an unusual fascination with machinery, something that wasn't exactly encouraged in his world. He worked at his family's sawmill, where he quickly developed a reputation as a master mechanic. He had a special talent for fixing diesel engines, something rare for someone in his community. In fact, people often said, if something's broken, just take it to Ed. He'll fix it better than anyone else. But his curiosity didn't stop with machines. He also had an interest in the outside world, something that made him stand out even more. Unlike most Amish men, Edward started spending time with non-Amish locals, forming friendships that others in his community wouldn't dare to. One of his closest friends was Dave Lindsay, an outsider with whom he felt comfortable enough to admit something shocking. He didn't really like the Amish way of life. This was a huge deal. The Amish are taught from birth that their way of life is sacred, that the outside world is filled with temptation and sin. For Edward to openly say he didn't want to be a part of it, that was unheard of. But then Katie Shetler entered the picture. Katie was the daughter of a highly respected Amish elder, and from the start, their relationship raised eyebrows. People whispered that Katie was too good for Edward, that his rebellious nature would cause trouble. But despite the rumors, family pressure pushed Edward to propose. The Amish believe in strong, traditional marriages, and backing out wasn't really an option. So, on a rainy day in 1986, Edward asked Katie to marry him. By the spring of 1987, they were officially husband and wife. At first, it seemed like Edward was settling into married life, just like everyone expected. Katie became pregnant soon after, and before long, she gave birth to their first child, a son named Danny, after Edward's father. From the outside, it looked like Edward was on the right path, married, working, raising a family. But beneath the surface, something was changing. Edward started to pull away from his community. He became distant, withdrawn, spending more and more time alone. It wasn't just that he missed his old friendships or his interest in machinery. This was different. The once outgoing, talkative Edward was now a man who barely spoke. He avoided gatherings, lost interest in his work, and started acting in ways that confused and worried those around him. Naturally, concern for Edward grew among his family and the Amish community. But in typical Amish fashion, they chose to support him the best way they knew how, staying close, offering quiet encouragement, and hoping for the best. What no one could have predicted, though, was that Edward's detachment was just the beginning. Because by July of 1988, Edward's condition took a disturbing turn. Dizzy spells became frequent, and he was sleeping an abnormal amount, sometimes for entire days. His worried wife, Katie, reached out for help, but in their Amish way of life, modern medicine was a last resort. Instead, they turned to a trusted chiropractor, a man favored by the Amish for his natural, drug-free remedies. His solution: toe pulling, foot rubs, and a jar of molasses, the latter meant to purify his blood. The cost? $25. Now let's be real, none of that was going to work. But Edward, desperate and with no other options, went through with it anyway. Despite multiple visits to the chiropractor and more molasses than anyone should ever have to consume, his condition didn't improve. But just when it seemed like everything was falling apart, a flicker of hope appeared. In 1989, Katie gave birth to their second son, and by 1990, they welcomed a daughter. For a moment, it seemed like life might settle down. But Edward, he was already too far gone. His presence in the family became almost non-existent. He avoided his wife and children, showing little to no interest in them. It wasn't just emotional distance. He became physically absent too, even refusing to sleep with Katie for fear she would become pregnant again. And when he did speak, it was only to mutter strange things under his breath. Things about darkness, about visions, about something coming. By the time 1991 rolled around, Edward was barely a shadow of the man he used to be. His physical health had taken a drastic hit. His once strong and capable hands now trembled with an eerie frailty. His skin had turned pale, almost translucent, and the hollowness in his eyes made it seem like he was peering into a world that no one else could see. Then, as if fate hadn't already dealt him a cruel enough hand, things got even worse. While working in his machine shop, he was exposed to toxic solvents, which only pushed his already fragile body further toward the edge. But here's the thing, the most terrifying changes weren't happening to his body, they were happening to his mind. At first the signs were subtle, almost easy to brush off. He would mumble to himself under his breath, his words barely decipherable, just a low, constant whisper that unnerved anyone who happened to overhear. But then the whispers grew, became more urgent, more frantic. He started answering questions no one had asked, responding to voices no one else could hear. Then came the laughter, soft at first, then suddenly erupting into maniacal fits that would shake his entire body. His family would find him staring into the distance, lips moving but making no sound, his expression one of pure, unfiltered terror. But the worst was yet to come. One night, without warning, Edward dropped to all fours and began racing around the living room like a wild animal. He howled, an inhuman, guttural sound that sent chills down the spines of everyone in the house. His eyes darted around wildly, as if he were seeing things that weren't there. And then, in a voice that wasn't quite his own, he started raving about giant rabbits with glowing eyes lurking in the dark corners of the house. He swore they were watching him, waiting for him. And if that wasn't disturbing enough, his ramblings took on an even darker tone. He began shouting, screaming, really about a war between God and Satan, a battle being waged for his very soul. His family could only watch in horror, unable to do anything but pray that whatever was happening to him would pass. But it didn't. It got worse. By 1992, Edward had descended into full-blown madness. His episodes became unpredictable, violent, and completely unhinged that he could no longer be left alone with his wife and children. At this point, they knew he needed medical intervention. But getting him to a hospital was no easy task. Edward resisted with everything he had, refusing to go willingly. His strength, fueled by some unseen force, was so overwhelming that his family was left with only one option. They had to hogtie him just to get him into the car. When they arrived at the emergency room, chaos erupted. The moment they freed him, Edward snapped. He lunged at nurses, sent medical equipment flying, and thrashed so violently that it took multiple people to hold him down. The medical staff had no choice but to sedate him, finally bringing his madness to a temporary halt. Doctors diagnosed him with a severe psychotic disorder and prescribed antipsychotic medication to calm his symptoms. And for a time it worked. The terrifying visions faded, the violent episodes ceased. But Edward hated the way the drugs made him feel. He described it as being trapped in a slow, foggy world, his body sluggish and his thoughts weighed down. He felt like a zombie, stripped of whatever was left of his identity. And so, like so many before him, Edward made a fateful decision. He stopped taking the medication. Edward's descent into madness reached terrifying depths in the early months of 1993. His mental health had deteriorated so drastically that his wife, Katie, was desperate for any kind of help. In March, She took him to see a well-respected Amish healer named Jacob Troyer, hoping for some kind of remedy. But Troyer took one look at Edward and knew that whatever was afflicting him was beyond any herbal cure or spiritual healing. His words were blunt and chilling. "Your husband has a mental problem. Take him to a hospital. I'm afraid of suicide. Goodbye and good luck." But whether it was fear, denial, or simply the way the Amish avoided outsiders, Katie didn't take him to a hospital. Instead, the next morning, Edward was taken to a chiropractor. The chiropractor massaged Edward's scalp, gave him some liver pills, and sent him on his way. A man whose mind was on the verge of complete collapse was given a head rub and some pills meant for digestion. Edward was drowning, and everyone around him was pretending he could just float back to the surface on his own. Now, as mentioned earlier, Edward didn't have many non-Amish friends, but one of the few he did have was a man named David Lindsay. David was a born-again Christian, deeply passionate about his faith, and determined to save lost souls. When he met Edward at the sawmill, he saw him as someone who needed to be rescued. David wasn't just trying to be a friend, he was trying to convert Edward. He told him that unless he left the Amish faith and became a born-again Christian, he would go to hell. Other evangelists who visited the woodshop repeated the same warnings, pushing Edward to believe that he was trapped, that his wife, his family, and his entire Amish way of life were keeping him prisoner. Edward's mind was already fragile, but these words sent him spiraling further. His paranoia grew. The thoughts that had once been mere whispers in his mind became deafening screams, and soon he began to see his own wife as something far worse than just an obstacle. To Edward, Katie was no longer just the woman who stood in his way. She was the devil. So on the morning of May 18, 1993, something inside Edward finally snapped. He had been drowning in depression for months, his mind slipping further into darkness. But that day it was different. Something evil had taken hold. The weight of his torment became unbearable, and as he stood in the kitchen watching his wife, Katie, go about her morning, a violent storm erupted within him. Without warning, he struck. His fist slammed into her face with brutal force, sending her crashing to the ground. "I am the devil," he screamed. Katie knew she had to act fast. She turned to her 6-year-old son, Danny, saying, "Run. Get Uncle Dan." Now, Danny didn't hesitate. He bolted out the door, his little feet pounding against the ground as he raced to his uncle's house. When he got there, breathless and wide-eyed, he could barely form the words saying, "Daddy isn't well." Dan had seen his brother in dark moments before, but this time, something in his nephew's voice sent a shiver down his spine. This wasn't just another one of Edward's breakdowns. This was something much worse. He ran toward the house, hoping, praying he wasn't too late. But the moment he stepped inside, those prayers were shattered. The scene before him was straight out of a nightmare. Edward was on top of Katie, his fists hammering into her face over and over again. The sound of flesh meeting bone was sickening, and with every brutal hit, blood sprayed across the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. It was pure, unrelenting violence. Bones cracked beneath Edward's relentless assault, their sharp snaps echoing through the house like the breaking of twigs. Later, when paramedics arrived, they would say Katie's face was so utterly destroyed that she was unrecognizable. Dan wanted to stop it. He wanted to do something, but the brother he knew was gone. What stood before him was a monster, lost in pure, uncontrollable rage. Before he could react, Edward stood up, lifted his boot, and with terrifying force stomped down on Katie's face. The crack that followed was sickening, the sound of bones turning to dust beneath his weight. Dan's stomach twisted. His mind screamed at him to intervene, but fear won. He turned and ran, bolting for help. But if you were Dan at that moment, what would you have done? Would you have stepped in, or would fear have paralyzed you? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because the horror was far from over. Edward stood there for a moment. Then with chilling calmness, he walked to the corner of the room, slipped on his heavy work boots, and returned to his wife's shattered body. And then he stomped again, and again, and again. Each blow crushed what little remained of her skull until her head was no longer a head, just a mess of blood, bone, and flesh. But even that wasn't enough. Something snapped inside Edward. Moving with eerie precision, he stripped Katie's body of its clothes, then walked to the kitchen. His blood-soaked hands reached for a steak knife, fingers curling around the handle, as if it were just another tool in his collection. Without hesitation, he plunged the blade into her abdomen and dragged it downward, cutting through skin, muscle, and tissue. Blood poured onto the floor, thick and dark, pooling around his feet. But Edward didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. His hands disappeared inside her, And then, in a moment so horrifying it defied all human logic, he began pulling her apart. One by one he removed her organs, her heart, her lungs, her liver, her kidneys, her spleen, her intestines. Each one, dripping with blood, was carefully placed in a neat, methodical pile beside her body. It was surgical, calculated, like he was completing a task rather than committing an atrocity. When it was over, he stood up, wiped his hands on his shirt, and walked to the sink. He turned on the water, letting the deep red stains swirl down the drain, as if washing away all evidence of his monstrous act. Then, as if it were just another day, he picked up his Bible, walked over to the fireplace, and threw it into the flames. After that, Edward turned to his 4-year-old son and 3-year-old daughter, their small faces frozen in fear. In a disturbingly calm voice, he told them to put on their coats, saying they were going to their grandfather's house. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added that he would come back to burn the house down. But fate had other plans. He never got the chance. The ambulance crew had already been warned that the scene was unsafe. The call described a disturbed man, with whispers that Edward was inside, killing his wife. Assistant Fire Chief Andrew McLaughlin immediately recognized the name. He had been to the household about a year earlier and had seen Edward in one of his terrifying episodes, howling like a wild animal, cackling, spitting, and lashing out as his family and paramedics struggled to restrain him. McLaughlin had been in the ambulance with Edward that day and remembered the chilling words he had whispered, "My heart is loose. I'm drowning on the inside." This time, the emergency team braced for another violent outburst, but when they found Edward walking calmly down the road with his 2 children, he was eerily quiet. He simply told them that his father would understand. However, when McLaughlin finally arrived at the Gingrich home, nothing could have prepared him for the nightmare inside. Katie's naked body lay sprawled on the floor, her skull shattered beyond recognition. Her internal organs were carefully arranged beside her, a grotesque and chilling sight. McLaughlin, horrified, immediately radioed his crew, ordering them to call the police and keep a close eye on Edward. The brutality of the scene was so overwhelming that one of the EMTs ran outside and vomited. When the police arrived, Edward was promptly arrested. He was read his rights, but he didn't resist. Instead, he freely admitted to killing his wife, as if it was a simple fact. At the station, officers ordered him to remove his boots and coat for evidence. As he did, a piece of flesh fell from his boot, a sickening reminder of what he had done. Even in custody, lost in his delusions, he muttered to the officers, "For some reason, I think we could still save her." It was only after his arrest that doctors finally diagnosed Edward with paranoid schizophrenia. A name was finally given to the illness that had tormented him for so long. But the diagnosis had come far too late. Too late to save Katie, too late to undo the horror he had unleashed. Neither the prosecution nor the defense ever disputed that Edward Gingrich had killed his wife. The evidence was clear, the crime undeniable. However, the argument was never about whether he did it, it was about why he did it. His attorney, Donald Lewis, painted a harrowing picture of a man trapped in the reality, let alone his own actions. Edward pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, a claim backed by chilling accounts of his deteriorating mental state. Edward had begged for help again and again to his father, to his wife, to his brothers. He spoke of the unbearable headaches that tormented him, of his growing fear that God had abandoned him, and of the dark presence he believed had taken hold of him. He was desperate, spiraling, but no one understood the true depth of his suffering. No one realized the horror that was coming. His wife Katie had lived in quiet submission, as was expected in their Amish community. She was a devoted mother and wife, but her husband was becoming more erratic by the day. Even as Edward's mind crumbled under the weight of his delusions, the Amish way of life rejected modern medicine. Instead of psychiatric care, he was treated by a chiropractor who, for 6 months, massaged his scalp and gave him molasses. Hours before Katie's death, that same chiropractor had treated Edward again, completely unaware of the monster brewing beneath his troubled surface. Then it happened. Edward's psychosis reached its breaking point in the most horrific way imaginable. When the fog lifted, Katie was dead. The brutality of the murder shocked even the most hardened individuals. But was it the act of a cold-blooded killer, or was it the tragic consequence of untreated mental illness? In the year 1994, Edward was convicted of involuntary manslaughter, but mentally ill. He was sentenced to 5 years in the prison ward of a mental hospital. The Amish community and the public at large were outraged. Many believed this sentence was far too lenient for such a horrific crime. Mental health professionals, and even members of his own community feared what would happen once Edward was released. Yet, there were others who took a different view. Some of Edward's fellow Amish saw his punishment as just, arguing that modern medicine had restored his sanity. They believed he was truly remorseful, that he deserved the opportunity to repent, and that with proper guidance, he could return to the community. Some even offered to take him in, pledging to supervise him. Against public outcry, Edward was released in the year 1998. He was placed in an Amish mental care facility in Michigan, but after an unspecified incident, he was transferred to an Indiana psychiatric unit designated for Amish individuals who required constant supervision. Still, he longed to return home. He wanted to see his children. He wanted to rebuild his life. Eventually, Edward moved back to Crawford County, but the life he had once known was gone. Though two of his brothers and his teenage sons had reconciled with him, the rest of the Amish community had not. Edward was shunned, cast out, forced to exist on the fringes of his former life. In the Amish world, shunning isn't just rejection, it's erasure. To be shunned means you are seen, but not acknowledged. You are there, yet you do not exist. His teenage daughter, Mary, was placed in the care of her grandparents and was forbidden from seeing him. Anyone who dared associate with Edward risked being shunned themselves. Even his children, innocent as they were not spared. Tensions ran so high that when some of the children attempted to attend a youth prayer meeting, they were arrested for defiant trespass. In April of the year 2007, Edward's desperation reached new heights. He and his sons orchestrated the kidnapping of his 17-year-old daughter, Mary, in a last-ditch attempt to reclaim a piece of the family he had lost. According to an affidavit from Mary's aunt, Clara Gingrich, Mary and Clara had been traveling in a horse-drawn buggy when Edward's brother, Dan, suddenly leapt onto the wagon, seized the reins, and redirected them toward another Gingrich brothers' property. As they neared the barn, Mary's brother grabbed the horses, leading them inside, where Edward and his other brothers were waiting. Surrounded and outnumbered, Mary was given an ultimatum: leave willingly with her father, or the police would force her to go with him. Convinced she had no choice, she went. For 5 days, Mary was missing. To many in the Amish community, the nightmare was repeating itself. A vulnerable young woman was in the hands of the same man who had murdered her mother. Some feared that Edward had suffered another psychotic break, that history would repeat itself in blood. When Mary was finally found, safe but shaken, Edward faced legal consequences once again. However, his punishment was shockingly light. He pleaded no contest to concealing the whereabouts of a child, and was sentenced to just 6 months of probation and a $500 fine. Despite regaining contact with some of his family, Edward remained an outcast. He could never fully return to his old life. For an Amish man, exile was a punishment far worse than prison. It was social death. Edward struggled with his guilt for years. He was haunted by the reality that his family could never fully embrace him without risking their own place in the community. His depression deepened, and he became more isolated. His mental state, once stabilized, began to decline once more. Then in the year 2011, nearly 2 decades after the murder of Katie Gingrich, Edward took his own life. He had been living with his attorney for 6 months. One day, the attorney's wife went out to the barn and found Edward's lifeless body hanging. He had left behind only one final message, scrawled in the dust on top of a bucket. "Forgive me, please." In a twist of irony, Edward was finally welcomed back into the Amish community after his death. He was buried beside Katie in an Amish cemetery, a gesture of reconciliation that sparked just as much controversy as his life had. Some saw it as an act of mercy, a way to finally grant him peace. Others saw it as an insult to Katie's memory. Despite their differing views, the Amish community gathered from far and wide to attend the funeral. They stood together in grief, offering support to Edward's brothers and sons. Now that he was gone, his family was no longer outcasts. They could return. They could belong again. And so the tragic chapter of Edward Gingrich finally came to a close. As you probably already know, the Amish are known for their simple way of life, rejecting modern conveniences and relying on their faith to guide them. But in Edward's case, their rejection of modern medicine may have sealed his fate, and that of his wife. Had he received proper psychiatric care instead of natural remedies, Katie might still be alive. Case 5. Minutes after this call, officers arrived at the home of Jose and Kitty Menendez to find them brutally shot to death. The attack was so violent that they were nearly unrecognizable. 7 years later, their own sons, Lyle and Eric Menendez, were convicted of the murders. Case closed, right? Not exactly, because decades later, this case still dominates headlines, documentaries, and even TikTok, with some arguing the brothers were victims of abuse rather than ruthless killers. But before we dive into that, let's look at the life they came from, because the Menendez family wasn't just wealthy, they were ultra-rich. See, they lived a life most could only dream of, flying on private jets, driving expensive cars, and even rubbing shoulders with celebrities in the late 1980s. Their mansion wasn't just a luxurious home. It was a multi-million-dollar estate that could easily belong to a Hollywood A-lister or a sports legend like Evander Holyfield. Everything they had was built on the back of their father's relentless ambition. However, Jose Enrique Menendez wasn't born into wealth. He fled Cuba as a teenager during the revolution, arriving in the United States at just 16 years old with nothing but determination. He worked tirelessly, earning a degree in accounting and later carving out a name for himself in the entertainment industry. He climbed the corporate ladder with precision, securing powerful roles at companies like RCA Records and eventually becoming a top executive at Live Entertainment, where he made millions. His wife, Kitty, was once a schoolteacher, but she left her career behind as Jose's success skyrocketed. With their growing fortune, the Menendezes gave their sons every possible privilege. Lyle and Eric attended elite private schools, wore designer clothes, and lived a life free from financial worries. But beneath the glamorous surface, cracks were forming in the perfect family image. Eric, the younger of the two, had an undeniable talent for tennis, ranking among the top young players in the country. His potential could have taken him to the professional level, competing against tennis legends like Pete Sampras and Andre Agassi. Lyle, the older brother, was accepted into Princeton University, but he struggled academically and was eventually suspended for plagiarism. By the summer of 1989, Lyle was 21 and Eric was 18. Their future was seemingly set. Their father's fortune, their connections, and their privileged upbringing meant they had access to a world of opportunity. The Menendez estate alone was worth well over $10 million and had things played out differently. Their father might have told them, "One day, kids, all of this will be yours." Instead, on the night of August 20th, the Menendez brothers walked into the family room where their father was watching television. Armed with shotguns, they unleashed a brutal attack, firing multiple rounds at their parents. The gunshots echoed through the mansion, shattering the illusion of a perfect family. When it was over, their father was riddled with bullets. His body slumped over in the chair where he had been watching television. Their mother, who had tried to escape, was shot so many times that part of her skull was blown away. The sheer violence of the attack stunned even the most seasoned investigators. But what happened next was just as shocking. The brothers didn't panic. They didn't flee in fear. Instead, they cleaned themselves up, changed into fresh clothes, and went to the movies. That night, while their parents' bodies lay lifeless in their blood-soaked home, Lyle and Eric sat in a theater, watching Batman. After that, they returned home, and that's when they called the cops and pretended to be shocked. "What's the problem? What's the problem?" "Someone killed my parents." "Pardon me?" "Someone killed my parents." "What? Who? Are they still there?" "Yes. The people who shot." "No, no, no." "Were they shocked?" "Eric, Matthew. Were they shocked?" "Yes." "They were shocked." "Yes." "What happened?" "Eric, stay down, Eric. Eric, stay down, Eric. I have a hysterical person on. I'm trying to get students, so their other units are funny." "Is the person still there?" "What happened?" "We have units around." "What happened?" "Who shot who?" "I don't hear anything. I just came home." "You came home and found who shot?" "My mom and dad." "Do you know if they're still in the house, the people that did the shooting?" "Eric, get out of my room." "Okay. Okay. Let me talk to Eric." When the police arrived at the scene, they found Eric rolling around on the front lawn, curled up in the fetal position, howling in grief. His cries echoed through the night, an Oscar-worthy performance that would have fooled even the most seasoned detectives. But given what they went through throughout their childhood, the realistic cries of them just make sense. The brothers sobbed, clung to each other, and played the part of heartbroken sons to perfection. But behind the theatrics, something didn't sit right. Investigators pieced together the brutal execution. Jose Menendez had been sitting on the couch watching television, completely unaware of what was coming. The first shotgun blast struck the back of his head, killing him instantly. The force of the shot was so powerful that it nearly decapitated him. Kitty, hearing the deafening explosion of gunfire, rushed into the room. Her scream barely had time to leave her lips before the second shot rang out. The blast struck her in the leg, sending her sprawling to the floor. She attempted to crawl away, leaving behind a slick trail of blood on the polished hardwood, but there was nowhere to go. Her own sons towered over her, reloading their weapons. The next round of shots tore through her chest and arms as she writhed in agony. But it wasn't enough. The final, devastating shot was delivered point-blank to her face, obliterating her features and rendering her unrecognizable. It was a grotesque overkill, something more akin to a mob hit than a spontaneous crime of passion. And then, in an eerie and calculated move, the brothers fired additional shots into their parents' kneecaps. This detail was chilling. Why would sons do such a thing to their own parents? To detectives, this screamed of a professional-style execution, a deliberate attempt to stage the murder as a mafia hit. But here's where things got truly bizarre. The Menendez brothers were not immediate suspects. Despite being the only people with a clear financial motive, despite their suspicious behavior, and despite the glaring brutality of the crime, the police initially bought into their grieving act. They didn't even test them for gunshot residue, a basic procedure in homicide investigations. For a while, it seemed like they might just get away with it, but their greed would be their downfall. In the weeks following the murders, instead of retreating into mourning, Lyle and Eric embarked on a jaw-dropping spending spree. Lyle returned to the Princeton area and began a kind of spending frenzy. His friends say they thought it was his way of dealing with his grief. Over several weeks, he bought clothes, a Rolex, a $62,000 Porsche. Rather than return to school, he bought a restaurant, saying his mother would have been pleased. Meanwhile, Eric wasn't exactly keeping a low profile either. He hired a new top-tier tennis coach. On top of that, the brothers vacationed in exotic locations like London and the Caribbean, dined at five-star restaurants in Los Angeles, and drove around town in their deceased mother's Mercedes-Benz SL convertible. The money hemorrhaged out of their accounts at an alarming rate. In just 6 months, they had burned through over $700,000. They moved into high-end condos in Marina del Rey, flaunting their newfound freedom with reckless abandon. But while they were celebrating their new lives, the police were busy chasing a dead end. Investigators initially believed Jose Menendez's business dealings had made him a target. He was known for his ruthless and cutthroat style, making enemies in the entertainment world. The police considered the possibility of a mob hit. The staged kneecap shots made it look like an organized crime execution. But something didn't add up. If the mafia wanted Jose dead, why kill Kitty too? And why had nothing been stolen? As detectives struggled to find leads, Eric made a mistake that cracked the case wide open. Feeling guilty, overwhelmed, and unable to keep the secret buried, he confided in his psychologist, Dr. Jerome Oziel. He admitted everything: how they planned the murder, how they executed it, and how they covered it up. Dr. Oziel, bound by doctor-patient confidentiality, initially kept the confession secret. But here's where things took a wild turn. Oziel had a mistress, a woman named Judilon Smith. She knew about the confession, and in a moment of betrayal, she went to the police. Now, if you were the doctor's mistress at the time, what would you have done? According to her, she knew that Lyle and Eric were sexually abused. So if you knew that for a fact, would you still report it to the police? I want to hear your thoughts on this. At this point, Lyle and Eric were still oblivious. They truly believed they had pulled off the perfect crime. Lyle even went so far as to hire bodyguards for his shopping trips, parading around like a celebrity. Additionally, the two brothers had just established their own business called the Menendez Investment Enterprises. But law enforcement wasn't so easily fooled. With Judilon Smith's tip, they finally had the breakthrough they needed. The police were about to turn the tables on the Menendez brothers, and the downfall of Lyle and Eric was just beginning. They arrested Lyle first, since he was in California, and then Eric was taken into custody after he returned from playing in a tennis tournament in Israel. The case, however, was anything but simple. The legal battle was just beginning, and what followed was a courtroom drama filled with shocking twists and relentless maneuvering from both the prosecution and defense. The prosecution had what they believed to be a solid piece of evidence: the therapy session tapes. A judge ruled that these tapes could be used in court, but the brothers had hired a top-tier legal team, and they fought tooth and nail to suppress them for over a year. Every motion, every appeal, every legal loophole was explored. It was a fierce battle of legal expertise and strategy, stretching out the case and delaying the inevitable. First things first, let's talk about the person who first knew who killed the Menendez parents, Dr. Jerome Oziel. I recall Eric said it began with sort of a casual conversation between the two of them. They started discussing what would happen, or how it would be if the person who was a dominating force and a negative force and a very controlling person in their life wasn't there anymore. And at that point, it evolved into a discussion about killing the parents, most particularly the father. Menendez described for you in particular what it was that he was upset with his father about. Yes, he did. What did he say? Well, basically that the father had just been completely dominating and controlling, was impossible to please, had perfectionistic standards, that he was controlling of a lot of different aspects of Eric and Lau's life in a very extreme way. They went up to the office where the infamous confession tape was recorded, a piece of evidence that would shake the entire case. But despite how damning the tape was, it didn't immediately lead to a guilty verdict. Instead, it played a major role in the Menendez brothers' defense. They claimed that their father had abused them for years, physically, emotionally, and sexually, and they saw no other way out. In the tape, the brothers not only admitted to the murders, but also revealed something shocking. They had found their mother's suicide note before the killings, which deeply affected their decision. Eric described his mother's pain, how she discovered their father's long-term affair, and how it broke her. He recalled her struggling with alcohol and pills, telling him, "You don't understand how much stress I'm under. I take 13 pills a day and drink." The brothers believed that by killing her, they were actually doing her a favor, freeing her from misery. But there was also another terrifying thought. If she took her own life, they would be left alone with their father. And that was even worse. Eric later testified in court, revealing horrifying details about the abuse. He said that one night, he finally told his older brother Lau what had been happening. When asked why, Eric simply said, "I wanted it to stop. I wanted 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 to stop." Lau described how their father forced him into oral sex, and even used pins and tacks to hurt him during the assaults. He also shared that their father once threatened him with a knife, a jagged Rambo knife, to keep him silent. Lau also took the stand and testified about the abuse he suffered between the ages of 6 and 8. After sports practices, he would massage me, and we would have these talks, and he would show me, and he would fondle me, and he would ask me to do the same with him, and I would touch him, and we would undress. Where would this take place? In my bedroom. And how often would this happen? Like 2 or 3 times a week. And for how long did this happen? Not too long. It began to change. When did it begin to change? I'm not sure exactly at what time, but almost close to when I was 7. And how did it change? I just became more involved. What do you mean more involved? We would be in the bathroom, and he would put me on my knees, and he would guide me all my movements, and I would have oral sex with him. Did you want to do this? To back up their claims, their defense team showed disturbing photographs as evidence, revealing the dark reality the brothers said they had endured. This is a proof sheet of the sequence of photographs from Eric's 6th birthday party. These photographs were found in an envelope with the handwriting of their mother, and among those photos, one that should have never existed, one of Lau's nakedness saved by his own mother. Lau would later testify that his father, Jose Menendez, took photographs of them in their most vulnerable moments, bathing, changing, just being kids. Lau said that he wouldn't ask. He wouldn't say anything. He would just come in, snap the photo, and leave. Lau described in court how, after sports practice, his father would massage him. Then the touching began. It escalated, and Lau was forced to touch back. After this, they would undress, and the nightmare played on repeat, 2 to 3 times a week in his bedroom or the bathroom. Then there were the object sessions. A toothbrush, a shaving brush, a tube of Vaseline. This was his father's twisted routine, and when Lau finally found the courage to tell his mother, her response was, "Stop exaggerating. Your father loves you. He's punishing you because you do things wrong." But the trauma didn't stop with Lyle. The abused become the abuser. Lyle admitted that he did the same to Eric. He took Eric to the woods. He used the same toothbrush. And in the courtroom, with the weight of his own guilt crushing him, he could only say one thing: "I'm sorry." Years later, Eric finally confided in Lyle. He revealed that their father had been abusing him too. And when Lyle confronted Jose about it, the fear set in. However, the prosecution had its own version of the story. They painted the Menendez brothers as cold-blooded killers who wiped their father's computer, erasing the will to cover up their crime. A computer expert testified that the data was gone, irretrievable. But here's the twist. Lyle's own computer expert confirmed that he was hired not to recover the files, but to make sure they could never be recovered. So was it greed or was it fear? Oh man, what's a win, you know? They're going to spend the rest of their lives in prison. On the good side, I will say that they're both such considerable human beings that they will find a way to be productive. And in fact, some of the jurors were saying that too. It was their expectation that they would both find a way to contribute to society, even if they're in prison for the rest of their lives. And I truly believe that's true of them, where I could not say that that's true for most people in their situation. Back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, conversations around male sexual abuse were almost non-existent. It wasn't just a taboo topic. It was something that society outright dismissed or refused to acknowledge. Many people found it hard to believe that men, especially young men from wealthy, privileged backgrounds, could be victims of such horrific abuse. The concept of male vulnerability was often met with skepticism, mockery, or outright denial. And when Lyle and Eric Menendez stood trial for the brutal murder of their parents, Jose and Kitty Menendez, the nation was divided. The trial, broadcasted in real time across national television, turned into a media spectacle. While some people sympathized with the brothers and believed their accounts of long-term sexual and physical abuse at the hands of their father, others ridiculed them, especially for the way they broke down in tears on the stand. At one point, SNL even created a skit poking fun at the brothers during their trial. Their emotional testimonies were dissected, with critics accusing them of faking their distress to gain sympathy. And it is your testimony that it was you who killed your parents, Jose and Kitty Menendez, and not your brothers, Lyle and Eric Menendez, to whom you bear a striking resemblance. Yes, and that you forced your two innocent brothers, Lyle and Eric Menendez, to confess to the murder? Yes. Late-night talk shows made them the butt of jokes, and tabloid headlines painted them as greedy, spoiled rich kids who had killed out of a thirst for money and freedom. However, the trial took an unexpected turn when a forensic psychologist took the stand, presenting a crucial argument. The crime was not premeditated. According to the psychologist, Lyle and Eric's actions stemmed from years of abuse, fear, and trauma, rather than cold, calculated planning. For a moment, it seemed like the judge was leaning in their favor, acknowledging that the psychological impact of prolonged abuse could have led to a spontaneous, desperate act of violence, rather than an orchestrated murder for financial gain. But then, in a shocking twist, a key witness in the case, Lyle Menendez's best friend, Donovan Goodrow, seemingly contradicted himself on the stand. Goodrow had previously provided a recorded statement in which he admitted that Lyle confided in him about years of sexual abuse at the hands of their father. However, in court, Goodrow shockingly denied ever hearing such things from Lyle. This contradiction sent shockwaves through the courtroom and was even aired on Prime 9 News. The revelation forced the trial into a temporary halt as the judge and attorneys debated the significance of the tape, which directly challenged Goodrow's testimony. At the heart of the case was a question that divided the nation. Were Lyle and Eric Menendez calculating killers who brutally executed their parents for inheritance money? Or were they lifelong victims who finally snapped after years of unspeakable torment? Describe your relationship with your father. Brutal. Prosecution was completely focused on the idea that Eric and Lyle Menendez were greedy rich kids that had killed their parents because they were in a hurry to inherit their money. The jury struggled to reach a consensus. After weeks of deliberation, both juries, one for Lyle and one for Eric, ended up hopelessly deadlocked. On January 13, 1994, Eric's jury announced they were unable to reach a verdict, and just days later, Lyle's jury did the same. The mistrials left the nation in turmoil with public opinion split. Some believed that the brothers' allegations of sexual abuse should have justified a lesser charge, such as manslaughter. Others argued that no amount of trauma could excuse such a brutal and premeditated act of murder. The prosecution, meanwhile, remained steadfast in its stance that the Menendez brothers were driven by greed rather than fear. When their second trial began in August 1995, the media frenzy had died down significantly. Judge Stanley Weisberg, who had presided over the first trial, made a critical decision. This time, no cameras were allowed in the courtroom. The lack of live television coverage meant the case no longer held the same level of public spectacle, and as a result, much of America lost interest in the proceedings. But behind closed doors, the defense faced major setbacks. Judge Weisberg significantly limited the testimony regarding the brothers' claims of sexual abuse, making it harder for the defense to argue that the killings were an act of desperation rather than cold-blooded murder. Additionally, unlike in the first trial, the jury was not given the option to convict the brothers of manslaughter instead of first-degree murder. Prosecutors dismissed the brothers' claims as nothing more than an abuse excuse and worked aggressively to dismantle their defense. Lyle, who had testified in the first trial, chose not to take the stand this time. On March 20, 1996, after just 4 days of deliberation, the jury found Lyle and Eric Menendez guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. 3 weeks later, after 3 more days of deliberations, the jury sentenced them both to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The once prominent Menendez brothers, who had grown up in Beverly Hills luxury, were now locked away for life, their fate sealed. But despite their convictions, their story was far from over. Years later, new evidence surfaced that suggested the Menendez brothers had been telling the truth all along. In May 2023, the defense team filed a habeas petition citing newly discovered evidence that could potentially overturn their convictions. One of the most significant pieces of evidence was a letter Eric Menendez had written to his cousin, Andy Cano, in December 1988, 8 months before the murders. In the letter, Eric detailed the ongoing sexual abuse he was enduring at the hands of his father. He expressed his fear, his inability to escape, and his hesitancy to tell anyone, even his own brother, because of his father's threats. Despite this evidence, the prosecution had previously dismissed Cano's testimony during the original trials, branding him a liar. However, the letter, written long before the murders, suggested that Eric had indeed been desperate for help, contradicting the prosecution's claim that the abuse allegations were fabricated after the fact to justify the killings. But the revelations didn't stop there. In 2023, Roy Rosillo, a former member of the Latin boy band Menudo, came forward with shocking allegations. Rosillo claimed that Jose Menendez, who was an RCA Records executive at the time, had sexually assaulted him when he was just 14 or 15 years old. According to Rosillo, Menendez had lured him to his home, drugged him, and raped him. He further alleged that he had suffered multiple assaults by Menendez, once before and once after a performance at Radio City Music Hall. His sworn affidavit was submitted as part of the Menendez brothers' legal appeal, lending further credibility to their claims of abuse. If their appeal is successful, the Menendez brothers could be retried under different charges, possibly reducing their convictions to manslaughter, given that the maximum penalty for voluntary manslaughter in California is 11 years per count, and considering they have already served more than 34 years behind bars, a retrial could mean their release. For decades, Lyle and Eric were kept in separate prisons, Lyle at Mule Creek State Prison and Eric at Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility. They were only allowed to communicate through letters. But in 2018, after nearly 20 years apart, the California Department of Corrections granted their request to be housed together. The moment they were reunited was deeply emotional, with both brothers expressing relief and joy at finally being able to see each other again. Life behind bars has been drastically different for each brother. Eric married his longtime pen pal, Tammy Ruth Sacamon, and has spent years painting and donating his artwork to charity. He even gifted a portrait to comedian Kathy Griffin. Lyle, on the other hand, has dedicated his time to inmate advocacy, serving as president of the inmate government at Mule Creek and working with support groups for survivors of sexual abuse. His first marriage ended in divorce after his wife discovered he had been writing letters to other women. Despite spending more than 3 decades in prison, the Menendez case has recently seen a resurgence in public interest, particularly among younger generations on social media platforms like TikTok. Many of these young activists argue that the Menendez brothers were victims who acted out of fear rather than greed. Thousands of supporters have written letters to California officials demanding clemency. Yet, after all these years, one question remains. Will Lyle and Eric Menendez ever walk free, or will they spend the rest of their lives behind bars? Case 6. These 2 little boys were the perfect example of how sometimes the real danger isn't lurking outside. It's sitting right across the dinner table. On the night of November 26, 2001, a quiet evening in Cantonment, Florida erupted into chaos. A frantic 911 call sent firefighters racing to a home engulfed in flames. First responders rushed in, expecting to find a tragic accident, maybe even a desperate attempt at escape gone wrong. But as they made their way inside, what they discovered was far worse than a fire. Lying motionless on the living room floor was 40-year-old Terry King. His body was twisted unnaturally, his head bashed in with such force that his skull was shattered beyond recognition. The fire, now clearly an afterthought, had been set to cover up something much darker. Terry hadn't died in the flames. Instead, he had been murdered in cold blood. But as investigators processed the gruesome scene, they quickly realized something even more disturbing. Terry's two sons, 13-year-old Derek and 12-year-old Alex, were nowhere to be found. At first, the situation seemed like an unspeakable tragedy. A father dead, his children possibly kidnapped, or even worse, trapped inside the burning house. But the truth that unfolded over the next few hours was something no one could have expected. When authorities located Derek and Alex nearby, the boys didn't run. They didn't cry. They didn't even hesitate. Instead, they calmly confessed. They had taken a baseball bat, crept into their father's room while he slept, and repeatedly beat him until his skull caved in. And then, as if that wasn't horrifying enough, they set the house on fire in an attempt to erase their crime. At first, their reasoning seemed simple. They claimed their father was too strict, that his punishments were too harsh. Spankings, rules, a home with too many restrictions. That was why they did it, they said. But something about their confession felt off. Their words were rehearsed, their emotions strangely absent. And then, just as quickly as they had admitted to the crime, they changed their story. Now, they said they weren't acting alone. A new name surfaced. 40-year-old Ricky Chavez, a local man who had been a family friend. According to the boys, Chavez had manipulated them, convinced them to kill their father, and after the crime, took them in, washing their bloody clothes and coaching them on what to say. He had given them a place to stay, a place where they wouldn't have to follow rules or face their father's discipline. But when pressed for details, the story changed yet again. Suddenly, Derek and Alex claimed that they never killed their father at all. Ricky Chavez had done it, they insisted. He had beaten Terry to death, then forced them to take the blame. Each new version of events contradicted the last, leaving investigators struggling to separate truth from lies. But then, a chilling revelation came to light, one that would shake the case to its core. Alex revealed that his relationship with Ricky Chavez wasn't just that of a family friend. According to him, Chavez had manipulated him into believing they were in love. He described a twisted dynamic where Chavez, a grown man, had taken advantage of him, convincing him that they shared something special. With every revelation, the case became more unsettling. Was this the story of two boys rebelling against an overly strict father? Or were they victims themselves, manipulated by a predator who had used them to carry out his own dark agenda? Before we begin to dissect every inch of this case, let's take a moment to understand the King family first. Terry Lee King was born in Florida on April 17, 1961. He met Janet Little at a young age, and by the time Terry was 23, the two had started living together. They went on to have two sons, Derek, born in 1988, and Alex, who followed just 14 months later. Life wasn't easy for the young couple. Financial struggles weighed them down, and by the time their boys were just toddlers, things took a turn for the worse. Their relationship fell apart, but even after breaking up, Terry and Janet continued living under the same roof for about 2 years. During this time, Janet gave birth to twins fathered by another man. Despite their split, Terry attempted to co-parent all 4 children with Janet, trying to make the best of a complicated situation. But raising 4 young children with limited resources became overwhelming. Desperate for a solution, the couple turned to the Heritage Christian Academy, a church-run institution that provided shelter for struggling families. The director introduced them to the idea of open adoptions, assuring them that their children would live with new families while still staying in touch with their biological parents. Believing this was in their children's best interest, Terry and Janet made the heartbreaking decision to give them up. Soon after, Janet moved out of Terry's home, leaving him behind to start over. Terry picked up another job, but it paid little, and he was barely getting by. 8 months later, another blow hit the family. The church shut down, unable to afford the costs of caring for the children. The 4 siblings were separated, each sent to different families across the state. Derek and Alex, once inseparable, were now miles apart. Alex, in particular, struggled. No matter how much his new family tried, he couldn't adjust. He cried endlessly, mourning the loss of his father. His distress became so unbearable that his foster parents ultimately sent him back to Terry. The boy clung to his father like a lifeline, refusing to be apart from him again. While Terry worked, Alex would sit quietly in the lunchroom playing by himself, and at night, he made a makeshift bed by pushing 2 chairs together, anything just to be near his dad. Meanwhile, Derek took a different path. As he grew older, his rebellious streak intensified. By the year 2001, Janet received a call from his foster parents. They could no longer handle him. They were at their breaking point, and just like that, Derek was sent back to Terry, reuniting with his younger brother. Around the same time, Janet had moved to Lexington, Kentucky, after marrying another man, while Terry had finally reached some stability. He had bought a rental home with a large garden, creating what seemed like a fresh start for his boys. Derek and Alex were enrolled at Ransom Middle School, and at first, things seemed to be settling down. They were bright kids, performing above average in their classes. But just as life started to resemble some kind of normalcy, everything unraveled. On November 16th, the boys vanished. Terry reported them missing, frantic with worry. Days passed, and then he received a phone call from his own children. They told him to stop looking for them, but Terry refused to give up. Frustrated by what he believed was police inaction, he even went to the local news, pleading for help. Then, on November 24th, there was a breakthrough. Derek was found wandering near a wooded area in Pace. The next day, Alex resurfaced, returning home. Neighbors saw the 3 of them together, preparing to leave the house to visit a friend. It looked like things might return to normal. Later that night, they came back home. But within hours, their house was engulfed in flames. Firefighters rushed to the scene, but what they found inside was far more horrifying than the fire itself. Authorities quickly pieced together the gruesome truth. The attack had happened in the dead of night. Terry had been asleep in his recliner, completely unaware that his own children were lurking in the shadows. Derek, gripping an aluminum baseball bat, struck the first blow, then another, and another. It was a ruthless, frenzied assault. The man who had fought so hard to keep his sons together was left unrecognizable. His skull had been shattered. As his lifeless body lay there, the boys set the house on fire, hoping the flames would erase the evidence. But fire doesn't destroy everything. Instead of seeking help, Derek and Alex fled. They didn't go to the police or a family member. They ran straight into the arms of Ricky Chavez, a man who had been lurking in the background of their lives for some time. Chavez wasn't just a family friend. He was a convicted felon with a troubling history. While Terry had been busy working hard as a single father, Chavez had been keeping a watchful eye on his boys, offering them an escape from their strict household. His home was their hideaway, a place where rules didn't apply. Investigators soon uncovered disturbing details. Chavez had more than just a casual friendship with the boys. He had introduced them to alcohol and marijuana, blurring the lines of authority. But the most unsettling revelation came from Alex himself. He confessed that he and Chavez weren't just friends. He claimed they were lovers. Chavez had manipulated him, convinced him they were in love. Authorities found letters, love notes written by Chavez to Alex, diary entries from the young boy professing his devotion to the 40-year-old man. It was clear this was grooming, and it raised a terrifying question. Had Chavez orchestrated the murder of Terry King? To understand just how deep Chavez's influence ran, you have to understand who he was in their lives. Every neighborhood has that one house, the one where kids gather, where rules are flexible, where no one asks too many questions. For Derek and Alex, that house belonged to Ricky Chavez. To some, he was just a friendly neighbor, the guy who let kids hang out at his place, play video games, and escape their troubles. But to others, there was something unsettling about him. Rumors swirled. Over the years, multiple minors had come forward with allegations of inappropriate relationships with Chavez. Yet, somehow, nothing ever stuck. As a father juggling work and raising 2 kids, Terry King had no idea about Chavez's past when he first allowed his sons to spend time there. As a struggling single father, he saw it as a blessing, someone willing to watch over Derek and Alex when he was working long hours. But the relationship between Chavez and the boys became too close. Prosecutors had a tangled case on their hands. 2 minors accused of patricide, a felon with suspicious ties to them, and a defense riddled with inconsistencies in statements of 2 young, angry boys. Alex took the stand first, his testimony retelling a horrific tale. On the night of the murder, he claimed, Chavez had sneaked into the house while Terry was asleep. The brothers had been woken and led outside, told to wait in the car while Chavez carried out the evils that he had kept hidden all these years. It wasn't until they reached Chavez's home that he revealed the truth. Terry, their father, was dead. The crime, he insisted, had been for them. The alternative, he allegedly warned, was far worse. Terry would have never allowed them to live with Chavis, even if it meant taking their lives himself. As the jury absorbed the disturbing details, Derek King supported his brother's version of events, though his emotions overwhelmed him. He spoke of how Chavis had promised them a better life, a life where they would be free, taken care of, and given everything they wanted. Yet, as he tried to put into words the gravity of what had happened, his composure shattered, which revealed the confusion of a child caught in the midst of something far beyond his understanding. With the prosecution's case laid out, the defense turned its attention to one crucial element, the confession. When the boys had first been arrested, they had admitted to the crime, offering chilling descriptions of their father's final moments. The defense seized upon this and argued that their detailed account clearly showed they had been present during the attack, not waiting outside in Chavis' car as they now claimed. The jury deliberated, reaching a decision in a short time. However, the verdict was sealed, its contents hidden until the conclusion of the second trial, the one in which Alex and Derek King, still barely more than children, would stand accused of the same crime. As the trial of the King brothers commenced, the two young defendants now sat in the courtroom in their best clothes, no longer just witnesses but accused murderers. The prosecution put forth an argument backed by tangible evidence that Alex had harbored a deep resentment toward his father and had convinced his younger brother to act. The motive, they argued, lay in Alex's infatuation with Chavis, a man who had fed him fantasies of love and freedom from his evil father. This was backed by the letters that were found at the scene, one of which read something like this: "My life used to be cloudy before I made friends with Rick. My ultimate goal in life now is what is. It is about sharing your life with someone else's. Before I met Rick, I was straight, but now I am gay." Unlike before, Derek did not testify, but Alex once again took the stand. The court listened as the prosecution introduced the deeply unsettling letters written by the boy, in which he described how Chavis had changed him, how he no longer saw himself as straight, how his ultimate goal in life was to be with the older man. These letters, the prosecution argued, showed the dangerous and strong influence Chavis had over Alex, an influence firm enough to push him toward murder. The defense, however, turned the focus back to Chavis. They painted him as a manipulative predator who had lured the boys into his grasp, exploiting their troubled home life and preying on their vulnerabilities. He had given them gifts, let them indulge in forbidden pleasures, and most importantly, convinced them that Terry King was the enemy. To Alex and Derek, he had been the savior they thought they needed, until they were left alone to take the fall. The jury weighed the conflicting narratives carefully. Were these two boys, still so childlike in their behavior, truly capable of such a heinous crime on their own? Or had they been merely pawns in a far darker game? The final answer came swiftly. In just 5 hours, the verdict was in. Alex and Derek King were found guilty. Their knowledge of the crime scene, their shifting testimonies, and their own confession ultimately convinced the jury that they had been present when their father was murdered. Case number 015612B. Verdict. We, the jury, find as follows as to count 1 of the indictment. Guilty of second-degree murder, a lesser-included offense, without a weapon. We, the jury, find as follows as to count 2 of the indictment. Guilty of arson as charged. So say we all this 6th day of September, 2002 for person Lynn Schwartz. State of Florida plaintiff versus Alex King defendant. Case number 015612B. Verdict. We, the jury, find as follows as to count 1 of the indictment. Guilty of second-degree murder, a lesser-included offense, without a weapon. Yet the court also seemed to acknowledge the complexities of the case. As most children their age prepared to return to school, Alex and Derek King prepared for a very different kind of future. A future inside the walls of Florida's juvenile detention centers. They had entered the world as victims, suspects, and pawns in a deadly game. And now they would pay for a crime whose true mastermind remained a mystery in the eyes of many. In an unconventional move, the prosecution tried both Chavis and the King brothers for the same crime. Chavis was acquitted despite the damning letters and his attempts to cover up the murder. The King brothers, however, were convicted of second-degree murder on September 6, 2002. But in yet another twist, the judge overturned their convictions, citing violations of due process. Rather than face another trial, the prosecution and defense reached a plea deal. Both Derek and Alex pleaded guilty to third-degree murder. Derek was sentenced to 8 years, Alex 7. But was justice truly served? Why did nobody consider the disturbing relationship of a minor with a convicted felon? Almost nobody would ask this question. Derek and Alex King entered prison as children and left as men. Long after the trials had ended and the headlines had begun to fade, the King brothers still had those who remained invested in their fate. Among them was journalist and writer Catherine Medico, whose interest in their case had shifted from professional to deeply personal. What had started as research for a book had transformed into an emotional bond, particularly with Alex. She had spent months exchanging letters with him, their conversations stretching over long phone calls. But it wasn't until late 2002 that she finally met him in prison. From the moment they were face to face, she felt an instant connection, as though he were a child in desperate need of care. Catherine was not alone in this sentiment. In different corners of the country, strangers had been drawn to the case, outraged by the way two children had been thrust into the adult legal system. Their frustration turned into action, culminating in the formation of the King Brothers Trust in 2003. Lisa Drew Alton spearheaded the initiative, determined to provide support for the boys once they were released. It was, she believed, a gesture of faith, an assurance that despite their past, they would not have to navigate their future alone. Among those who became involved was Dan Daly, a widower and freelance writer from Texas. Through online discussions about the case, he had connected with Lisa, who suggested he send Derek books in prison. A simple act of kindness turned into something much more when he received a heartfelt thank you letter from the boy. That letter marked the beginning of an unexpected friendship. Over time, they corresponded frequently, and Daly made the long drive to Florida several times to visit Derek behind bars. He was struck by the boy's openness, the way he spoke about his guilt without hesitation. For Daly, the relationship was not about the notoriety of the case, but about helping a young life find direction after a tragic past. As Alex and Derek spent their formative years behind bars, these unlikely supporters waited for them on the outside. But there remained a looming question. Were the boys worth saving? Would they emerge from prison rehabilitated? Or would they become hard-hearted criminals like so many before them? When Alex King finally walked free, he did not dwell on the past. At 19, nearly a year and a half out of prison, he presented himself as someone who had left the darkness behind. He had built a new life, one he never imagined possible, with a family that embraced him as one of their own. Prison had changed him, though for years he had felt emotionally numb, disconnected from reality. The full weight of his circumstances had not sunk in until he made a reckless mistake, one that nearly cost him his freedom all over again. In April 2005, with 3 years remaining on his sentence, Alex and another inmate attempted an escape. Their plan had been amateurish at best, stuffing their beds to make it appear as though they were still sleeping, then slipping into a classroom where they attempted to climb through the ceiling. The plan failed, and they found themselves right back where they started, caught before they even had a chance to make it beyond the walls of the facility. The consequences were severe. Arrested and booked on new charges, Alex faced the terrifying possibility of an additional 15 years behind bars. It was then that Catherine Medico rushed to see him, shaken by the news. When she expressed her worry, his response was dismissive. She wasn't his mother, he told her, but she refused to accept that. In her eyes, Alex was as much her child as her own biological children. Something in that moment shifted. The next time she received a letter from him, it was addressed simply, "Dear Mother." From that day forward, he never called her anything else. Derek was released at the age of 20 in 2009, after serving 7 years. Alex was freed a year earlier, in 2008, at the age of 18. But freedom didn't guarantee a new beginning. Alex King's life had been anything but ordinary. From a troubled childhood to a high-profile murder trial, his past had always loomed over him like a shadow he could never escape. And now, at just 35 years old, his story had come to a tragic end. For years, Alex struggled with drug addiction, a battle that, according to his uncle Greg King, had consumed him. The last time Greg saw Alex was 5 years ago in Pensacola. He had urged his nephew to enter a rehab program, but Alex found it difficult to handle confinement yet again. Whether it was prison walls or the strict rules of rehab, he always found a way to run. On April 14th, Alex was found unresponsive in Missoula, Montana, after a drug overdose. Doctors at Providence St. Patrick Hospital fought to save him, but the damage had been done. It wasn't his first overdose in recent weeks. In fact, the doctor treating him recognized him immediately. Alex had already been in the hospital several times before. This time around, however, he wasn't so lucky. His heart had stopped. Medical staff worked desperately to revive him, But after days on life support, Alex King was declared legally dead on April 23, 2024. His family gathered for a final goodbye, though not in person. His last moments were witnessed through a screen, a heartbreaking farewell from miles away. He had once been the boy at the center of a case that captivated the nation, the child who made a confession that changed everything. But in the end, Alex King was just another lost soul, caught in the tight grip of a past that never let him go. And Ricky Chavez? He remains incarcerated, serving a 35-year sentence, not for murder, but for false imprisonment and being an accessory to the crime. The murder of Terry King also ignited a media firestorm. Were the boys victims of abuse or cold-blooded killers? A book, A Perversion of Justice, a Southern Tragedy of Murder, Lies and Innocence Betrayed, argued that they were innocent. But Assistant State Attorney David Rimmer had his own take. There will always be people who believe Derek and Alex are innocent, just like there will always be people who believe that Michael Jackson is innocent. The murder of Terry King was not just a local tragedy. It became a nationwide sensation, dividing public opinion and sparking heated debates about justice, abuse, and manipulation. One of the most controversial takes on the case came from authors Catherine Medico and Molly Barrows in their book, A Perversion of Justice, a Southern Tragedy of Murder, Lies and Innocence Betrayed. The book painted the King brothers not as cold-blooded killers, but as victims, children caught in a web of manipulation and discrepancies in the legal system. It suggested that the justice system failed them, raising a question that left goosebumps. Were the boys innocent all along? Years after their release, Derek and Alex King sat down for an exclusive Dateline NBC interview in a special titled Second Chances. For the first time in years, the brothers reunited on camera, their faces now marked by time and the weight of their past. They reflected on the choices that led them to that fateful night and the scars they carried from it. The case was also the subject of Evil Kin Season 1, Episode 5, titled Deadly Darlings. The episode delved deep into the chilling bond between the King brothers and the sinister influence of Ricky Chavez. The legal battle that followed was examined in American Justice Season 12, Episode 21, Blood Brothers, the Derek and Alex King case. It presented the twists and turns of the trial, leaving audiences to decide, were these boys monsters or merely pawns in a much larger, darker game? Even decades later, the story of Terry King's murder remains as unsettling as ever. Some still believe justice was served, while others insist that the full truth has yet to be uncovered. Case 7. The Jacobson family had everything: wealth, success, and a beautiful home in Wellington, Florida. From the outside, they were the picture of a perfect, loving family. But if there's one thing we've learned, it's that appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the surface, hidden behind the walls of their dream home, was a story far darker than anyone could have imagined. And on what should have been a joyful birthday celebration for these two little boys, everything unraveled in the most heartbreaking way, leaving a tragedy so profound that the entire nation would never forget their names. And trust me when I say, this is the kind of case that will stay with you for days, leaving you with one haunting question. What kind of father could pull the trigger on his own family? To truly understand this story, we have to go back to 1989, when Neil Mason Jacobson first met Frankie Sue Salkoff. Their paths crossed at a gym in Bayside, Queens, New York, where they both lived and worked at the time. From the very beginning, they seemed like the perfect match, both ambitious, successful, and thriving in their careers. Frankie was making a name for herself at the prestigious Lehman Brothers, a powerhouse in the financial world, while Neil had already built his own boutique firm on Long Island. They were young, driven, and on the path to what many would call the American dream. Those who knew them spoke highly of their relationship, describing it as one built on deep admiration and affection. Frankie was completely devoted to Neil, and in return, he was seen as the charismatic, kind-hearted man who had everything going for him. Within his family and social circle, he was often regarded as the golden boy, intelligent, charming, and seemingly unstoppable. He had a way of making things work, and to everyone around him, he and Frankie appeared to be the perfect couple. It wasn't long before they took the next step, getting married and settling into Neil's home in New Jersey. Their transition into married life was effortless. Neil continued to grow his career in mortgage banking, eventually launching his own mortgage brokerage firm, while Frankie remained dedicated to her work in finance. Together, they built a comfortable and fulfilling life, filled with shared passions and adventures. They were the kind of couple who did everything together: bicycling, scuba diving, weekend getaways to the countryside, creating memories that only strengthened their bond. From the outside looking in, they had it all. But despite their seemingly perfect marriage, there was one thing missing: children. They longed to start a family, but the journey to parenthood was not an easy one. For years, they faced the devastating reality of infertility, enduring the exhausting process of multiple fertility treatments, each one bringing a wave of hope and heartbreak. It was an emotional battle, but they refused to give up. Finally, after years of waiting and struggling, their prayers were answered in 2003, when they welcomed twin boys, Joshua and Eric. Already blessed with a comfortable life, Frankie and Neil were happier than they had ever imagined. Their family felt whole, and they were thriving in both their personal and professional lives. However, there was another lingering challenge: distance. Neil's parents, Harold and Goldie Jacobson, had moved from New Jersey to Florida in the year 2000, and while they enjoyed their new home, they deeply missed being close to their son and his growing family. They often voiced their frustration about the separation, wishing they could spend more time with their grandchildren. By 2005, life took an unexpected turn for the Jacobson family when Harold was diagnosed with cancer. His condition worsened quickly, making travel to New Jersey impossible. This became a breaking point for Neil. The thought of being so far from his father during such a critical time was unbearable. Without hesitation, he made a firm decision. He was moving his family to Florida to be closer to his parents. But even before the move, Neil had already started investing in Florida real estate. He had purchased a pre-construction investment condo in Lantana, and not long after, he bought another. Real estate became somewhat of an obsession for him, and soon he found himself purchasing a third pre-construction condo. He knew he was overextending financially, but the allure of the booming market kept him going. Frankie, on the other hand, was skeptical. She voiced her concerns, questioning the practicality of his growing investments. But Neil was determined, his mind was set, and nothing was going to change it. With his properties piling up in Florida, Neil began pushing Frankie to relocate. She was resistant, hesitant to leave behind the life they had built in New Jersey. She loved their home, their community, and the stability they had created. But as time passed, the financial strain of maintaining their New Jersey home became overwhelming. The mortgage was becoming too much to handle, and eventually, Frankie reluctantly agreed to the move. The Jacobsons officially settled in Florida, eager to start a new chapter close to family. However, things did not go as planned. Neil had hoped to sell their New Jersey home before the move, but the market wasn't in his favor. With no other choice, he decided to list it for rent, hoping it would at least generate some income. But just 2 months after they arrived in Florida, tragedy struck. Harold Jacobson passed away. The loss of his father devastated Neil in ways he hadn't expected. He had uprooted his entire life to be closer to Harold, only to lose him so soon after arriving. The grief weighed heavily on him, and his mother, Goldie, later revealed that Neil had struggled with his mental health from a young age. She recalled that as a teenager, he had been diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder, an issue that had plagued him for years. Doctors had noted that Neil had an overwhelming desire to be the perfect child, a pressure that had followed him into adulthood. As the years passed, his struggles with anxiety only grew, and soon, things took an even darker turn. The Great Recession hit Florida hard, and Neil, who worked as a mortgage broker, found himself in an increasingly difficult situation. The real estate market collapsed, and the once thriving business that had allowed him to invest so freely was now crumbling beneath him. The financial security he had worked so hard to build was slipping away, and as the weight of his losses grew heavier, so did the cracks in his once stable world. The Florida condos he had invested in before relocating were quickly turning into a financial nightmare. Burdened with subprime mortgages, their payments increased month after month, stretching his resources thin. At first, Neil had convinced himself that things would turn around. He had always been a problem solver, always found a way to make things work. But this time, no amount of determination could keep the walls from closing in. With little to no work coming in and 4 separate mortgages draining their finances, the pressure became unbearable. At first, Neil and Frankie tried to hold on, dipping into their savings to stay afloat. But as time passed, their financial situation only worsened. Bills piled up, debt collectors began calling, and the stress of trying to keep everything together was pushing Neil to his limits. Desperate for a solution, he started making risky financial decisions, one bad choice after another, each one digging them deeper into a hole. He chased after risky investments, sought out loans, and even considered selling off what little they had left. all in a futile attempt to stop the inevitable collapse. Eventually, the weight of it all became too much to bear. The financial juggling act had run its course, and Frankie, exhausted and drained, made the painful decision to stop paying the mortgages on their 3 Florida condos. It was a move that felt like surrender, but they had no choice. There was simply no more money left to give. By the year 2008, the pressure of Neil's business failures had begun to take a serious toll on his health. At first, it started with minor complaints, aches and pains that he couldn't quite explain. But as time went on, his symptoms worsened. He became sluggish, struggling to muster the energy for even the most basic tasks. His body felt heavy, his mind clouded. There were random bouts of dizziness that left him feeling unstable, and he found himself unable to focus the way he used to. Concerned, he visited the family doctor, who ordered a blood test in October. The results were troubling. Neil had elevated hormone levels, but there was no immediate explanation for his decline. As the weeks passed, his condition only worsened. The once energetic and determined man was now lethargic, withdrawn, and barely functioning. He was eventually diagnosed with depression and transient peripheral vertigo, a condition that further contributed to his constant dizziness. In an attempt to help him cope, his doctor prescribed Zoloft, a common antidepressant. Neil, desperate to feel better, took the medication as prescribed, hoping it would offer some relief. But instead of improving, his mental state deteriorated further. A few days after starting Zoloft, he was called back to the doctor's office, where they added a prescription for Xanax. It was meant to ease his anxiety, but his family and friends quickly noticed that something wasn't right. Instead of stabilizing his mood, the medication seemed to send him spiraling even further into darkness. His paranoia intensified, his emotions became more erratic, and the man they had once known began to fade before their eyes. Neil's sister, Deborah, became deeply concerned about her brother's rapid decline. She confided in their mother, worried about what he was going through. According to Deborah, Neil had started experiencing terrifying hallucinations. He had grown increasingly paranoid, convinced that someone or something was out to get him. Frankie, his wife, was just as alarmed. She reached out to her own sister, desperate for support, as Neil's behavior became more and more disturbing. He had completely withdrawn from the world. He refused to go outside, stopped engaging with friends and family, and even neglected his own hygiene. There were days when he wouldn't even shower, lost in a haze of fear and depression. His paranoia took a terrifying turn when he became obsessed with the idea that the FBI was watching him. He was convinced that federal agents were surveilling him, gathering evidence to have him arrested. He would talk about it constantly, warning anyone who would listen that they were building a case against him. His delusions became more elaborate. He was certain that his phone was tapped, that his home was under surveillance, that at any moment the authorities would storm in and take him away. His mother saw the full extent of his paranoia one of the last times she visited him. Neil had pulled her aside, his voice shaking with fear. He told her he was in big trouble. He insisted that the FBI was coming for him, that he had done something terrible, though he couldn't seem to explain exactly what. The fear in his eyes was real, raw, and overwhelming. But before we continue, I need to ask you something. Cases like this, where someone leaves behind a trail of warning signs before doing the unthinkable, are more common than we'd like to admit. We've covered story after story where red flags were everywhere, yet somehow, no one managed to stop the disaster before it happened. So, if you ever noticed someone you knew showing these signs, acting strangely, withdrawing, saying things that just don't sit right, what would you do? Would you step in? Would you know what to say? I really want to hear your thoughts on this. Now back to the story. As Neil Jacobson's mind unraveled, so did his grip on reality. And on that fateful day, January 23, 2010, the darkness he had been wrestling with for months finally took over, and what happened next would shock everyone who had ever known him. That morning, Neil stood before his wardrobe, fumbling with the top shelf, his hands shaking as he retrieved a loaded gun. His wife, Frankie, still groggy from sleep, watched in confusion, not yet realizing the horror that was unfolding before her. Neil, with the gun in hand, stepped out of the wardrobe, his face hardening into something almost unrecognizable. Frankie's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit her. He wasn't holding the gun to defend himself, he was holding it with purpose. In an instant, panic took over. She leapt toward him, struggling desperately to wrest the weapon from his grasp. They tumbled to the floor to fight a chaotic blur of screams, desperation, and tears. In the midst of the struggle, Neil, in a violent frenzy, struck Frankie, knocking out her front tooth and slicing her finger. Despite the brutality of it all, Frankie didn't give up. She fought with all her strength, but Neil was too much, overpowering her in his disturbed state. With cold detachment, he stood, reloaded the gun, and turned the weapon on her. 2 shots rang out, one after another, each striking her in the face, silencing her forever. But Neil's twisted path didn't end there. Covered in Frankie's blood, he reloaded the gun and made his way to his son, Eric's room. Eric, who had been lying on his stomach in peaceful sleep, was the next victim in the nightmare that Neil had somehow constructed in his mind. 2 bullets tore through Eric's body, but against all odds, the boy survived the first 2 shots. But Neil was undeterred, his mind fixated on finishing what he had started. He grabbed a pillow and pressed it over Eric's face, ensuring his son wouldn't survive. 2 more shots, and Eric was gone. The house was eerily still now, as Neil moved toward the next room, where his youngest son, Joshua, was sleeping. Joshua, blissfully unaware of the carnage around him, lay curled in his sheets. Neil's actions were methodical, almost as if he were following a script. He covered his son's face with a pillow, silencing him with 2 shots to the face. In a matter of moments, the vibrant life of his family had been extinguished. With the blood of his wife and children staining his hands, Neil walked to the bathroom and turned on the shower. He stood under the water, numb, as if washing away the sins he could no longer escape. When the shower ended, he dressed, swallowed a cocktail of Vicodin and Xanax, and in a haze left his home. As he drove, the pills began to take effect, making him groggy and disoriented. Less than a mile from his mother's house, Neil passed out behind the wheel, swerving off the road and coming to a stop in the grass. In the confusion, Neil had initially planned to kill his mother, Goldie, next, before taking his life. But in his twisted state, something inside him held him back. He later told the police that when he was at home standing in the living room, he thought about going to heaven to be with his father. But he couldn't leave his mother alone, so he planned to take her with him. Thankfully, he never made it to her house. When the police found him, Neil was disoriented, barely conscious, and gripping the gun beside him. As they approached, he muttered, "I killed my family," in a dazed, broken voice. The investigation raised many questions. Was Neil a victim of the side effects of his medications, or had he planned this horrific act all along? A suicide note found later suggested that Neil may have been preparing for this moment, leaving many to wonder whether he was driven by his medications, or if he had, at some point, simply snapped. And as what you might expect, from the very beginning, Neil's defense centered around his mental state. His attorneys argued that he had been suffering from severe depression, anxiety, and paranoia, all of which had been worsened by the medications he was taking. They described a man overwhelmed by financial ruin, haunted by the fear that the FBI was watching him, and convinced that there was no way out. His legal team insisted that he had not acted out of hatred or rage, but had instead been driven to an unimaginable breaking point due to the side effects of his prescription drugs. To support their argument, the defense brought in medical experts who testified about the dangers of Zoloft and Xanax, the 2 medications Neil had been prescribed before the murders. These drugs, they explained, could cause extreme mood swings, hallucinations, and suicidal tendencies, especially when taken together in high doses. Neil's behavior before the killings, his paranoia, delusions, and refusal to leave the house, was presented as clear evidence that he had lost his grip on reality. His lawyers pushed the narrative that Neil had been a loving father and husband, a man who had never shown any signs of before, making it hard to believe that he had killed his family intentionally. But the prosecution had a different story to tell. They painted Neil not as a victim of medication, but as a desperate man who had methodically planned the murders. They argued that his financial troubles had reached a boiling point, and that instead of facing them, he had chosen to take his family's lives in an act of ultimate control. They pointed to the way he had executed the killings, retrieving his gun, reloading it multiple times, and ensuring that no one survived. To them, this was not the act of a man lost in a haze of confusion, but one who had made a deliberate and calculated decision. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence against Neil was the suicide note found in his home. The note indicated that he had thought through his actions and accepted what he was about to do. It wasn't the frantic scribblings of someone in the middle of a psychotic episode. It was organized, reflective, and, in the prosecution's view, proof of premeditation. If he had truly been unaware of his actions, why would he have left behind such a message? The prosecution also called witnesses to testify about Neil's behavior leading up to the murders. His sister Deborah had noticed a dramatic shift in his personality. He had become increasingly paranoid, talking about the FBI coming to arrest him. His wife, Frankie, had confided in her sister that Neil was no longer the man she had married. He had stopped showering, refused to leave the house, and seemed trapped in his own mind. While the defense used these accounts to argue that Neil was suffering from a mental breakdown, the prosecution used them to show that there had been warning signs that should have led Neil to seek professional help instead of resorting to murder. Neil's mother, Goldie, also played a heartbreaking role in the trial. She had been one of the last people to see him before the tragedy. When she recalled how Neil had told her, "Mom, I love you no matter what happens," the courtroom fell silent. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it, but in hindsight, it was clear. He had been preparing for what he was about to do. Goldie, who had always seen her son as a kind and loving man, struggled to reconcile the Neil she knew with the one on trial for murder. As the trial progressed, the jury was left to decide whether Neil Jacobson had truly been in a state of drug-induced psychosis, or if he had coldly and deliberately murdered his wife and children. The prosecution emphasized that Neil had made a series of conscious choices, loading his gun, aiming at his loved ones, pulling the trigger multiple times. They argued that no matter what struggles he was facing, nothing justified what he had done. The defense, on the other hand, urged the jury to consider his mental state, to see him as a broken man who had been consumed by fear, paranoia, and desperation. After days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge, while acknowledging the tragedy of the situation, made it clear that no level of financial distress or mental illness excused the murder of innocent children and a devoted wife. Neil Jacobson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His fate was sealed, and the courtroom was filled with an overwhelming sense of loss. Victor and Tiffany, Neil Jacobson reached a plea deal with the state. He changed his plea of not guilty to guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. Now, after killing his family, he tried to kill himself, in fact, even leaving behind a suicide note detailing why he did it. He said the reason was the family's mounting financial situation. Now, he's going to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Neil Jacobson answered to the judge in this Palm Beach County courtroom today, admitting that he shot his wife, Frankie, and then shot their twin 7-year-old sons while they were asleep in their Wellington home back in 2010. But when it was the family's turn to speak in court, Neil held his head and never looked up. "There's not a day that goes by that I don't hear my sister saying, 'Good morning, Sherry. Good morning, Sherry. What are you doing today? What did you eat for breakfast today? It's not going to be a good morning, Robin. How are you?'" Even after the trial ended, many questions remained. Could this tragedy have been prevented if Neil had received a different treatment? Were the medications to blame, or was he simply a man who refused to face his failures? No one could say for certain. What was undeniable, however, was that a mother and 2 young boys had lost their lives in the most horrific way possible, and nothing could ever undo that. Now I want to hear your thoughts. What do you think drove Neil Jacobson to do something so unthinkable? Was it the weight of his financial struggles, the side effects of his medication, or something much deeper?